This was obviously the man's idea of revenge for his having taken the book, and he would be forced to sit through all of it. Please don't bring out the visuals like Erosenin did. Please don't bring out the visuals like Erosenin did. He silently prayed as Kakashi began to explain the purpose of foreplay. Chapter 5, the week after. Sasuke rubbed his chafed wrists and sighed in relief after Sakura cut the wire that bound him to the post when she was reasonably certain that their new sensei was long gone. Before he departed, his new sensei had left him with a great deal to think about. The first of which was the fact that the man didn't seem to practically worship the ground that he walked on like his academy instructors, barring Iruka, who treated all of his students based on their actual performance rather than their clan affiliation, had done. In fact, his new instructor seemed to hate him. After Hitaki-sensei had informed him that the team had passed when Naruto and Sakura had shared their lunches, which were sadly devoid of the tasty cherry tomatoes he'd watched Naruto eating with him, the man had told them that those who break the rules are trash, and those who abandon or betray their teammates are worse than trash. The man had been looking directly at him when he'd said that. After Naruto had run off rather than explain how he knew the contents of that dirty book that belonged to their new sensei and Sakura had left, the man turned to look at him as he struggled with his unusually complicated bonds which had resisted all attempts at the rope shredding technique. "Did you know it was an Uchiha who had told me that?" the man had asked after studying him for a few seconds. "Told you what?" he'd asked. "Those who break the rules are trash. Those who abandon their teammates are worse than trash," the man had replied. He'd said non-committally, replying how he usually did when someone recounted a tale involving one of the members of his clan, usually to show their understanding of his loss. Obito gave his life for his teammates and his village during the war, the man had said. "When the time comes, would you do the same?" He'd given another non-committal thought so. More's the pity since, when the older generation think of the Uchiha, the first thing that comes to mind are those amongst your clan who were willing to die for the village and risk their lives daily to protect its people. The man had said coldly before he'd turned and walked away, leaving him tied to the stump. He'd then spent the next half hour wondering if he would be willing to die for Konoha. If he did so too soon, however, he would never get his revenge against Itachi, and his clan would never be avenged. That vengeance had been his reason for existence for the past 4.5 years. Could he die for something as ephemeral as the village and a pair of morons that he disliked, knowing he'd failed in his quest? Would he be willing to die for Konoha after he'd avenged his clan? Feeling vaguely guilty that the answer to both questions seemed to be no, he brushed past Sakura without thanking her and headed home, ignoring her pleas for a date. During the week following the bell test, things had been interesting for Naruto, to say the least. The morning after the bell test, Kakashi had given him an "even though you covered me in orange paint and took my book I still like you" hug and a cherry sucker on the way to the team's usual rendezvous point. Learning that Kakashi paradoxically hadn't hated him for pranking him had taken a great deal of weight off his shoulders that he hadn't known he was carrying. After trying to sort out why this might be, he finally figured that Kakashi had decided to call them even after he had forced him to sit through the talk for over 2 hours. With a relieved smile over the fact that his sensei didn't hate him, he raced ahead so he wouldn't arrive after Kakashi again. Being later than Kakashi was just too weird for words. Iruka-sensei had seen that hug by some odd coincidence, and his reaction to it had been downright unusual. The minute Kakashi had dismissed the team at the end of the day's training, Iruka had come over and led him to a nearby park. When they'd reached the park, Iruka had led him to a relatively isolated spot and looked around as if he was afraid of being overheard. Once he was pretty sure that they were alone, he started giving him the lecture on the bad kind of touching that the old man Hokage had given him after a certain incident when he was 5. Naturally, he found this to be far more embarrassing than receiving the talk from Kakashi, who, much to his relief, hadn't brought out visuals as Ero-sennin had when he'd given him the talk during their training trip. He'd been completely puzzled as to why he was receiving this lecture until Iruka-sensei had started asking strange questions about Kakashi. Iruka had thought Kakashi was one of those kind of perverts. The thought of Kakashi being like that had been too alien to process, so he did the only thing he could at the time. He started laughing, and he didn't stop until he nearly passed out from lack of oxygen. It didn't help Kakashi-sensei's case any that Iruka-sensei knew him well enough to know his smile was a mask to cover his pain and loneliness more often than not, and that his laughter was often a cover for embarrassment and discomfort. Because he knew him so well, Iruka-sensei had taken his hysterical laughter to be a clear sign that there was something seriously wrong. Rather than taking his laughter to mean that the exceedingly uncomfortable conversation had just gone way past embarrassing and was rapidly heading off into uncharted territory as it had, Iruka had come to the mistaken conclusion that Kakashi had been molesting him and started seriously interrogating him. Seeing the look on Iruka's face after he'd told him that nothing had happened and that the hug he'd seen earlier that day had been an apology for making him sit and listen to the talk for over 2 hours when he'd tried to reassure him and tell him that things with Kakashi-sensei were fine, he knew he'd said something wrong. 2 hours? Iruka yelled. 2 hours? The lesson on biology, as it pertains to human reproduction, is only an hour long. What the hell was he talking about for the other hour? The other stuff. He'd replied, turning slightly red. During the talk from the day before, Kakashi had not merely gone over the purpose and basic mechanics of sexual intercourse as the academy had done during one of the lessons he'd skipped, but had given him the advanced lecture which included information on the prevention of unwanted pregnancies and the various diseases one could contract as well as information on a couple of the not-so-basic positions. Aside from the lack of mortifyingly embarrassing visuals, the talk he'd received from Kakashi-sensei had been rather similar to the one he'd received from Ero Sennin on his 14th birthday. Being forced to sit through either lecture was an experience that he'd rather forget. What other stuff? Iruka asked, looking as if he were dreading the answer. You know, the stuff that's in those perverted books he likes to read. He mumbled, trying to end the conversation, not wanting to continue this discussion as he had wanted to forget the embarrassment of Kakashi's lecture and put it behind him. The look on Iruka's face when he'd stormed off at that point had been positively murderous. When he was called into the Hokage's office the next morning, both Iruka and a somewhat bruised Kakashi were there. Both men were dismissed upon his arrival, and the Hokage had set up a bunch of privacy seals before speaking with him. Apparently, after he'd stormed away the evening before, Iruka had beaten the crap out of a very surprised Kakashi, and had leveled some pretty serious allegations against him. After a long conversation with the old man Hokage during which he was practically interrogated about the talk, the hugging, and the gifts Kakashi-sensei had been giving him, he was finally released and Kakashi had been called in. After an hour during which he'd anxiously waited outside, afraid of what could happen to his sensei thanks to an unfortunate misunderstanding, the one-eyed Jounin left the Hokage's office with an odd look in his eye and a book on parenting in his hand. When the old man Hokage had explained to Iruka that it had all been one hell of a misunderstanding afterward, his former sensei apparently didn't believe him because he had taken to following him every spare minute he had, and rather closely scrutinizing his interactions with Kakashi whenever he was in the vicinity. Jiraiya smiled as he finally reached the gates of a still-standing Konoha. The journey here both had and hadn't been arduous as the points that defined his trip depended on when one considered it to have begun, but he was finally home. What to do first? Find an apartment, talk to his godson, then do some research? Find his godson, get an apartment together, then research? Research and save everything else for later since the information he had would be spoiled if he moved too soon, meaning that it had to wait? What the hell had he been thinking? Research first, of course. He'd been walking all day and he wasn't in the mood to go tromping around town this late in the afternoon searching for either Naruto or an apartment or both. Plan decided upon, he went to find the small knothole in the fence on the women's side of one of the local onsen which had been there for generations. Naruto could wait for a while, as he'd waited for longer before. He could get a room at a hotel for the evening, and Orochimaru wasn't going to be here for months. Research came first. Tenzo sighed as he glanced around the bar. Contrary to the information he had been given, Tsunade wasn't there. Or she wasn't in the more public area of the bar at least. Maybe she would be found enjoying the unregulated gambling in the back room. Sighing, he made his way to the back where a slightly less than legit craps game was taking place. She wasn't in the back room. Time to check the next bar. Sighing in frustration once more, he left. He had spent a week drifting from town to town, and so far his search had been fruitless, and it could take several more weeks or months of relentless searching before he found his target. At night, he had nightmares where he went searching from town to town practically forever, just one step behind Tsunade, failed to get the necklace from her in time, and instead of releasing less than a tael of the Kyuubi's power, Naruto ended up completely losing control and turning the completely freed Kyuubi loose on the helpless land of Wave. Kakashi practically melted at the look of appreciation in Naruto's eyes as he handed him the newly completed outfit that he'd just picked up from the tailor. It had definitely been worth the expense. All in all, the outfit which had been modeled on the clothes that the boy's mother had made for him wasn't half bad, and Naruto clearly appreciated it if the way he was turning around in front of the mirror was any indication. The loose, embroidered top that went down to just below Naruto's knees, as he'd apparently grown a few centimeters in the year between now and his death, since the top was supposed to come to his knees, had several nearly invisible pockets hidden amongst the elaborate embroidered wave and leaf design, and had the full Uzumaki clan symbol rather than the general one for Uzushiogakure that was on Naruto's old clothing stitched onto the back of it, nearly as large as the Uchiha fan was on the Uchiha. Bratz shirts. The flame orange pants that went with the top weren't too tight or so loose that they hindered Naruto's movement, like with the oversized tracksuit the boy always wore, even though the cuffs had to be rolled up. I had some extra tops and pants made in a similar style, though not nearly as elaborate as those. There's 2 orange, 1 blue, and 1 green top, all with the Uzumaki clan symbol. There is also 1 other pair of pants in orange, 2 in blue, and 1 in green. He said as he held out another one of the bags he'd brought with him when he'd come to his student's apartment after leaving the tailor's shop. At this, Naruto showed his appreciation for the gifts he'd just received by giving him one of the flying tackle hugs he usually reserved for Irika. Smiling behind his mask, he returned the hug. He continued to smile throughout the meal of instant ramen that Naruto had offered him afterward. That Naruto had been willing to share his precious ramen with him had been a clear sign that he had indeed been truly grateful for the gifts he had received. The instant he left Naruto's apartment building, Irika stepped out of the shadows of a nearby alley and accosted him. "How did you know Naruto's measurements?" Irika asked, not even bothering to mask his suspicion. "I measured him for his clothes for his funeral because you couldn't do it, and the Hokage didn't force you to." He thought his memories he'd been trying to forget had come unbidden. That day had been horrible. Irika had been nearly as broken as him at that time, and possibly even more so. Naruto had been a bit like a son and a little brother rolled into one to the scarred Chunin, had been the first of his students to die, and at the hands of another of his students no less. In the state he'd been in, Irika had been unable to face seeing Naruto's body again, and so out of the few people Tsunade could trust with the task, it had fallen to him to take the measurements. After he had refused to acknowledge the Hokage's summons 3 times, Shizune had come to his apartment carrying a black-edged storage scroll that had contained Naruto's body and forced him to get out of bed to do the task. His student. His fault. His responsibility. He would of course be telling the current Irika none of this. "I checked his clothing size when I put away the groceries I brought him while he was out. I then measured a couple outfits in those sizes, added a couple inches for future growth so he didn't need new clothes right away, and gave my estimates to the tailor," he said, making up his answer on the fly. Irika clearly didn't buy his explanation. Probably because all of Naruto's old clothes were oversized. He'd known his answer was a lame one the instant he'd uttered it, but it had been all he'd been able to come up with as he'd tried to tamp down memories that didn't belong now that he'd been given a second chance to make things right. Memories of things that would never happen again. The second Irika lunged for him, he ran for it. Sticking around when the Yumino was like this was inadvisable. The man was at least twice as strong as usual when it came to defending Naruto, and was willing to protect Naruto both in life and in death. After the boy's funeral, the man had single-handedly stared down the mob that had come to object to the fact Naruto had been buried beside his father. Going up against Iruka when he was like this was pointless, and would most likely end with him being hospitalized, which he definitely did not need right now. He could understand Iruka's suspicions in regards to his intentions towards Minato-sensei's son. His sudden interest in a child he had gone out of his way to avoid for the past 12 years would seem highly unusual to anybody who knew him. But he just wished that Iruka would go back to being mad at him for something he had actually done. At least then, he would have earned the beating he was sure to eventually receive. Getting a drink and waiting for Iruka to cool off sounded like a good plan right about now. When he arrived at the bar, Madogai had come over to where Kakashi was seated by himself with the vague idea of challenging him to a drinking contest. From the look in Kakashi's eye as he swirled the drink in his glass, something was wrong. Considering the rumors that had been making their way through the ranks lately, he had a feeling that Kakashi's mood had something to do with Iruka's accusations. "What's wrong?" he asked his eternal rival when he reached the booth that the man was holed up in. Standing in front of his rival, as he currently was, he could clearly see that now was not the time for such things as drinking contests. If, say that Hyuga you have on your genin team for instance, decided to betray Konoha and killed that clone of yours Rock Lee, and you went back in time to prevent it, how would you react when you saw the Hyuga boy and Lee again? How would you treat your students knowing one could kill one or both of his teammates at any time and your time with Lee could be cut short all too soon? Kakashi asked, looking at him in a manner that indicated that his question was entirely serious, and that he was asking for an honest answer from a friend rather than a fun answer from his eternal rival. At first, the question threw him. Of all the things Kakashi could be upset about, that was what he had been brooding over. It seemed so completely random and off the wall until he thought about it for a second, trying to see underneath the underneath, as Kakashi was fond of saying. Now that he was looking beneath the surface, he could see that Kakashi clearly thought that one of his students was a danger to the others and believed that it would be a short time before said student murdered or at the very least seriously injured one or both of his teammates. Why would Niji betray Konoha? He asked, trying to get more information so he could formulate a response that could possibly help ease his friend's worries. He was offered power so he could get revenge for something that happened in his past. Kakashi replied. Why would Lee die? He asked, hoping for more clarification as Kakashi's answer to the first question had been vague enough to be a reference to either the Uchiha boy or the Jinchuriki, since both boys had events in their pasts that they could want revenge for. He thought Niji was his friend for some strange reason, and went to get him back. Kakashi replied sadly, looking into his drink once more. Still too vague. But then there were Kakashi's actions to consider. Iruka had accused Kakashi of being a pedophile because he had taken to constantly hugging the fox child, which was rather out of character for the man. There had, of course, been some raised eyebrows when he himself had started hugging Lee to show his support and appreciation for a job well done. He would have hugged his other students as well if they didn't run at the first sign that he was about to do so. Would Kakashi be more likely to hug someone he thought needed a reminder that there was someone there for them, or would he be more likely to hug someone he was afraid he was going to lose? Seeing as Kakashi wasn't really one for showing physical displays of affection, he honestly didn't know the answer to that question. Not knowing exactly which way to go on that question, he decided to consider what little he knew of Kakashi's students. The Uchiha boy had been the only survivor of the Uchiha massacre besides the perpetrator, was the top rookie of his year, and was known to be somewhat aloof. Aside from that, the boy was an almost complete cipher. He knew almost nothing about the pink-haired girl, and Kakashi had indicated that the likely murderer would be male. After a long series of pranks that had grown increasingly destructive as time passed, the fox brat had recently defaced the Hokage monument and had also rather recently gotten into trouble for stealing a scroll of forbidden jutsu. Both of those activities hinted at something much darker than the pranks they'd been passed off as. So, is Uzumaki going to be a danger to anyone else? He asked, wondering if he should warn his team about the boy who'd recently started showing up to talk to Lee and Tenten out of the blue. The crunching sound of Kakashi's glass breaking in his hand startled him, as did the way Kakashi was looking at him. The man's glare was positively murderous. Why is it when there is trouble, everyone blames Naruto? Kakashi asked coldly. He is completely loyal to the village, his teammates, what few real friends he has, and almost none of them have repaid him in kind. Despite all that he has been through, Naruto would sooner kill himself than betray Konoha or his teammates. He decided it would be best to retreat at that point, as he'd apparently put his foot in his mouth. He'd obviously given the wrong answer and hit a seriously raw nerve in regards to the Uzumaki. Noticing that Asuma and Kurenai were sitting together at the bar, he indicated that he was going to head over and talk to them, before he practically ran off. What was that all about? Asuma asked as soon as he reached them. The Uchiha boy has said or done something to make Kakashi believe that he's going to snap and kill his teammates. He replied, wondering how the hell he managed to miss such an important clue when Kakashi had been talking to him. Kakashi had used the member of one of Konoha's most powerful clans who had been wronged by family as an example of the possible murderer and his most devoted student who had to overcome discrimination due to his so-called disability as the possible victim. His beloved student who had been considered a loser and the dead last back in the academy. The parallels were pretty damn obvious. Why was he upset at you though? Kurenai asked. He'd been trying to hint at it rather than say it outright, and I misread the clues he was giving me and guessed that he'd been talking about the Uzumaki boy. He replied. Why would Kakashi get so worked up about that? Kurenai asked. My father did offer Kakashi custody of the boy at one point after there was an incident at the orphanage he was living at the time which had resulted in the child no longer being welcome on the premises. There must have been a reason for him to do so, and it is possible that Kakashi was close to one or both of the boy's parents before they died. If he felt that the child of the person he had been close to was in danger, it would be quite likely for him to be upset. It also explains why he acts so out of character in regards to the boy. Asuma said thoughtfully. He only started showing affection towards the boy shortly after Mizuki attempted to murder him in an attempt to frame him for the theft of that scroll, probably out of guilt that he hadn't been there to protect him as he felt he should have. Considering the fact that Kakashi generally keeps people at arm's length, and the only other time I remember Kakashi going through a sudden personality change was after that teammate of his died, the incident must have severely shaken him. Asuma continued, looking down at his own drink contemplatively. Chapter 6, Apartment Hunting in Paranoid Irika. Jiraiya was up bright and well, not exactly early that afternoon. After giving his clothes a sniff test and finding them marginally acceptable, he dressed, declared himself ready for the day, left the room he'd rented the night before, and made his way out into the village. He purchased his breakfast/late lunch along with a newspaper at a nearby 24-hour Shinobi Mart after waiting in line for 10 minutes while a Chunin argued with the clerk about returning some kunai he'd purchased there the day before, apparently too blind to see the NO refunds sign the harried civilian kept pointing at. After wolfing down his slightly stale roll and gulping down the cup of lukewarm coffee, he turned to the apartments for rent section of the classifieds and circled several likely options. He then crossed off 2 of the circled selections after realizing upon further reflection that they were actually coded messages, one arranging a time for when a young couple would be eloping and the other from a ninja who was holding his teammate's dog for ransom. After he was done, he went in search of his former/future student since he planned on bringing him along when he viewed the selected apartments as the kid would be living with him. After he broke in and established that Naruto wasn't home, he headed out to Team 7's favorite training ground. Kakashi had been the first to greet him when he arrived as his genin had been much too busy training to do more than make an idle note of his presence as they continued with their tree climbing lesson. Jiraiya-sama. This is an unexpected surprise, Kakashi said, looking truly surprised. I just dropped by to see how my godson was doing, and if he was available to go apartment hunting with me. He replied, getting straight to the point. Will you be training him then? Kakashi asked in a rather guarded tone. Maybe in my spare time. I won't be removing him from your team just yet. He replied. Naruto, get out of that tree, there's someone I'd like you to meet. Kakashi called over to the boy, who supposedly hadn't learned tree walking until the disastrous mission to Wave that his former/future student hadn't liked talking about according to the reports he had read and the scant accounts he had heard from the boy, rather than continue questioning him. He didn't know how it had happened, but Kakashi had seemed far more intent on training Naruto during the 15 minutes he'd watched Team 7 work than he had in Naruto's stories of the man and what little of Naruto's training he'd seen during the last time around. It was possible that back then he'd caught his student during a bad month and that Naruto had complained about Kakashi so much because he didn't think he had gotten enough one-on-one training from him and thought that the man was focusing on the Uchiha boy with whom he'd had an ongoing rivalry too much. This theory was more plausible when he considered the fact that after the training trip, the Hatake had spent weeks helping Naruto master his elemental manipulation techniques and improve the Rasengan. Because Kakashi seemed so intent on training Naruto, he felt secure in mostly leaving him in the young man's hands for the most part. The fact remained that he needed to train himself so he could be prepared for the coming confrontation with Orochimaru. At Kakashi's call, the blonde-haired boy who wasn't in his ubiquitous jumpsuit, but rather wearing an outfit he'd never seen before which consisted of a green top with the Uzumaki clan symbol on the back and orange pants raced over looking excited. When he stopped a foot away from where he and the Hatake were standing, he noticed that the boy had a mischievous look in his eye that swiftly vanished. Who's this Kakashi-sensei? Naruto asked, looking so much like his mother at that moment that he began to sweat. This is your godfather, the Toad Sage Jiraiya. He's been away hunting a missing nin for the last 11.5 years. Kakashi replied. Nice to meet you, Jiraiya. Naruto said, grinning in a manner which was more reminiscent of his father than his mother, which upped his panic level several notches since, while Minato generally wasn't one for pulling pranks, he'd learned the hard way to watch out for that particular smile the few times it had revealed itself. Say Naruto, how would you like to stay in a better apartment for a while? He asked. Since I'm your godfather, I'm responsible for several things and your care and feeding is one of them which I'll be able to tend to now since I'll be in town for some time, and will be needing a new apartment anyways. What about my plants? Naruto asked, not asking a single question about him or the apartment they'd ostensibly be living in. He had a vague feeling that he should find that to be rather worrisome, considering the fact that the boy was quite willing to move in with a person he'd just met, godfather or no. You can bring them with us. He replied, knowing that that was the only response he could give in regards to the things. He remembered that Naruto's plants, some of which had lived in his apartment, and others of which had lived in a makeshift greenhouse on the roof of the building, had been the boy's pride and joy. Tending to those plants was one of the few hobbies that the boy enjoyed outside of training. The look on Naruto's face when he entrusted his plants to the few friends he had before he left Konoha for 3 years of training had been pitiful. Okay. Naruto said, grinning brightly. And, with that, the matter of housing was settled as far as Naruto was concerned. All that was left was actually finding a place to live. Naruto smiled. Today had gone quite nicely if he said so himself. He had managed to get a certain cheap bastard who had a habit of emptying his Gamachan rather than spending his own money to shell out for a 2-bedroom apartment and, Jiraiya had done something perverted enough during the hunt for said apartment for him to be able to start calling him by his old nickname. A nickname that the man hated just as much this time around as he had the last time. Erosenin, what time should I start bringing my stuff over tomorrow? He asked the second Jiraiya had finished signing the lease. How many times have I asked you to stop calling me that? Jiraiya said in annoyance. 5. He replied, knowing it had been many more before he had finally given up about 1.5 years before he died. It had only been 5 in this timeline, however. You can start bringing your crap over after you finish with your day's training. Jiraiya replied with a sigh. I've got to go meet with the Hokage about something now, so I'll meet up with you later. Wait a minute. He's going to be living here? The apartment manager said, finally catching on to what they had been talking about, apparently having been too absorbed in getting all of the paperwork in order before now to pay any attention to their conversation. Yeah, the kid's going to be staying with me. I'll pay an extra pet deposit or whatever. It's not like he'll be a problem or anything. Jiraiya replied casually. There was a dangerous look in his eyes that belied his tone, however, and he was now playing with a kunai that he hadn't been holding a moment ago. The manager, who lived in a ninja village and was therefore forced to interact with ninja on a regular basis, especially since several of his tenants were ninja, was only barely cowed, which was rather commendable considering the Sanin's reputation. But he's the manager weakly protested, cutting himself off before he said something that would get himself killed. The fourth Hokage asked me to look after him before he died. I kinda got caught up in chasing after a certain traitor for quite some time, but I recently got my priorities straight and I decided to come back and keep my promise. If you make things harder for me, Jiraiya said in a slightly more threatening tone, no longer playing with the kunai which was still in his hand. Those had apparently been the magic words, as the manager had then swallowed all of his objections. Fine, the manager said. But, if he damages anything, you're paying for it. With that, Jiraiya grumbled as he paid the pet deposit the manager had taken him up on. When the Sannin was finished with the extra paperwork on which he had been listed as a pet fox, they both went their separate ways. As he was heading towards his apartment to pack, he ran into Iruka. Accepting Iruka's offer of ramen, he followed his best friend and first father figure to Ichiraku's. After they had arrived at Ichiraku's and made their orders, Iruka asked Naruto about his day. Naruto grinned and brightly and cheerily chattered at him about how he helped his teammates in the tree climbing exercise and how he had helped someone he called Arosinin find an apartment. And I'll be moving in after training tomorrow. Naruto finished. He choked on his ramen when his brain finally processed the boy's final statement. You're moving where? He asked, hoping he'd missed something somewhere in Naruto's excited chatter that he couldn't always follow. Arosenin's new apartment, Naruto said in a matter-of-fact tone before going back to inhaling his ramen. This was bad. This was very bad. First, Hatake Kakashi had taken a rather inappropriate interest in his student, constantly touching Naruto every time he saw him, and now someone whose nickname, roughly translated to perverted hermit, had convinced Naruto to move in with him. Was the boy a pedophile magnet or something? The last time he'd tried to explain the bad kind of touching to Naruto after he'd seen Kakashi hugging the boy for an extremely inappropriate length of time before handing him a lollipop, the boy had stared at him blankly before he fell to the ground laughing. Despite this clear sign of distress, he knew what Naruto's happy laughter sounded like, and that hadn't been it. Naruto had denied that anything had happened to him, and continued to deny it afterward even though he'd seen any number of signs that something was going on. All of the circumstantial evidence he'd been able to gather since that day hadn't been proof enough of Kakashi's guilt according to the Hokage, who preferred to give Kakashi the benefit of the doubt, where he would have launched a serious investigation had it been anyone else. Now, someone else had discovered and was seeking to exploit Naruto's vulnerability in this area since they had seen that Kakashi was being allowed to get away with such things. Since nobody else was willing to do it, it was up to him to protect Naruto from those who would exploit him in this and any other manner. Naruto, older men don't usually ask boys your age to move in with them unless they want something, he said, trying to remain calm, not wanting to upset or frighten the boy into silence. His first instinct, however, was to find the bastard who'd convinced Naruto to move in with him and eviscerate him before leaving his body somewhere public as a warning to others who might be contemplating following a similar path. You think Arosenin's A was as far as Naruto got before he fell to the ground laughing. While Naruto's laughter was amused on one level, it was tinged with serious discomfort on another, which was a clear sign that something was wrong and that Naruto was in distress. Apparently, something had already happened and he'd already failed to protect Naruto. As Naruto rolled around on the ground laughing, rather large man in his mid to late 40s or early 50s with unruly white hair held back by a custom hitayate with the kanji for oil on it, and a pair of odd red lines running down his face approached Ichiraku's. He seemed familiar but he couldn't place the man's face at the moment. "Naruto, I knew I'd find you here," the man said, watching in amusement as Naruto rolled around on the ground laughing in distress. "Hi Erosenin." Naruto choked out between amused/disturbed laughs. "What's so funny?" the man asked. "Iruka-sensei thinks you're the other K kind of pervert." Naruto choked out before he dissolved into fits of laughter. The man stood there staring at Naruto in confusion. It was all the opening he needed. "Stay away from Naruto, you pervert," he yelled, kunai in hand, prepared to kill the man in order to protect Naruto. Tenzo wondered for the 5th time how the hell he'd managed to find himself running down a dark alley, or as close to running as he could get supporting a wounded shinobi from IWA. He would have to get the man medical attention in the next town over, as he was pretty sure that the local authorities were looking for the both of them at the moment. The last thing he remembered before ending up in the labyrinth of alleyways he was currently navigating was trying to avoid the knockdown drag-out brawl that was going on in the bar he had been vainly searching. He vaguely remembered seeing a flash of blonde and the swirl of an ominously familiar black cloak with red clouds and instinctively putting up a barrier to protect himself about half a second before the explosion. He had absolutely no idea how he'd managed to survive Deidara's idea of art after that, or where the hell he'd picked up the chunin from IWA since there hadn't been any in the bar. All he knew was that he had to run, and that he had to get the guy he was half-carrying some medical attention soon. Kakashi sighed as he looked down at his drink. He was making a disturbing habit of visiting the local jounin bar. 2 visits in such a short span were most definitely not normal for him, considering the fact that he'd previously had to be dragged here during a social occasion of some sort and had been able to count on one hand with fingers left over the number of times he'd been here in the last 3 years. It had apparently now become the place to brood when he didn't want anyone who might be looking for him to find him, however. When had he become jealous of Jiraiya? Why was he jealous of Jiraiya? He knew full well that his own apartment was far too small to keep Naruto in, and he couldn't rent a bigger apartment with his current income and spending habits, which included the care and feeding of several dogs who lived with him as often as they lived wherever it was they did when they weren't being summoned. Jiraiya, however, had the means to support Naruto comfortably. Sighing once again, he knocked back his drink and got up to leave, only to be stopped by a startled exclamation about the current bane of his existence. "Yumino Iruka did what?" One of the people at the bar yelled after the person who had entered the bar as he himself had finished his drink had raced over to the man and said something. He paused in order to listen in, as whatever it was that the Yumino had done, it was sure to be interesting. Chapter 7, Sasuke's Secret. Sarutobi Hiruzen, 3rd Hokage of Konoha, felt like repeatedly slamming his head against his desk. It was bad enough that Iruka was in here practically daily commenting on how inappropriately Kakashi was acting towards Naruto, but the man had recently taken to attacking Jiraiya as well, and the fact that Jiraiya is one of the legendary Sannin didn't seem to faze the academy instructor in the least. On top of Iruka's overprotective behavior was the headache of Jiraiya actually fulfilling his duties as godfather towards Naruto. If he had known it would be this bad, he would have told the man to stay away from him, as he clearly had absolutely no idea as to how to properly raise a child. First, there had been the complaints that came to his office from the owner of the apartment building Jiraiya was renting a unit in, who had objected to Naruto's presence and attempted to evict him. The key word here being attempted. The poor man soon discovered that the assistants he'd enlisted after the first failure were useless. There were jounin and then there were jounin, and if one of the legendary Sannin didn't want to cooperate. Then, there had been the angry Kunoichi who had found Jiraiya trying to convince Naruto to peek into the women's baths at the local onsen. After that, had been the bill he'd received from the owner of a local bar after Jiraiya loudly objected to the fact that they wouldn't serve Naruto due to certain laws that had been put in place in order to curb teenage alcoholism and somehow ended up causing a fight that wrecked half the bar. Rumor has it that Irika was somehow involved. All of these incidents had taken place within the span of 36 hours of his former student taking custody of the boy, and more reports kept coming in practically hourly, and naturally, all of these reports naturally added to the paperwork he had to deal with daily, which made his daily headache that much worse. He prayed that Konoha would still be standing by the end of the month. With the way things were going, however, it was quite possible that that would not be the case. Anger roiled in Kakashi's gut as he watched Naruto, who should have been asleep at that moment since he would be getting an early start later that morning, drag a drunken Jiraiya out of yet another bar. Though he would take Naruto in a heartbeat, especially now that he saw that even with his issues he'd be a much better guardian than that bum Jiraiya, it was practically impossible at the moment. If his nice little apartment hadn't been smaller than that dump Naruto used to live in, he would have offered to take the boy in on the day he had returned. With his current income though, he couldn't afford a larger place, and he had only barely been able to afford the gifts he had been buying the boy to make up for the 12 years he had pretty much ignored him. Normally, he didn't know how he felt about Naruto living with Jiraiya. While the man had been his sensei's Jonin instructor and had been named the boy's godfather by Minato-sensei himself, he was highly irresponsible and had pretty much abandoned the boy for the last 12 years as well. Also, while Naruto was with him, he lacked the supervision and support that the parenting book the Hokage had given him said was necessary for a child's healthy development. Naruto seemed happy to be with the man he'd labeled Erosenin, despite all of his faults though. That, and Irika's attacks on him had tapered off quite a bit now that he had a new target to focus on. Fortunately, Naruto was capable of mostly caring for himself as he'd already done so for years, and hadn't missed any training since moving in with the bum a few days before. Today's training had gone as well as could be expected considering the team he had. The fact that Naruto constantly tried to help the Uchiha who repeatedly made it clear that he had no need or desire for assistance had been disturbing, and the worry that history would repeat itself started to gnaw at him as he watched Naruto keep trying to help. If Naruto considered the Uchiha to be more a friend than a rival, he would try to bring him back after he inevitably betrayed the village. This time though, he would try his damned hardest to make sure it wouldn't be Naruto laying dead on the ground in a puddle of his own blood. Tenzo smiled. Finally, after weeks of searching and several misadventures that he would dearly love to forget and would probably be reliving in his nightmares for years to come, he had found Tsunade. Now to figure out how to get her to put her necklace up as stakes for a bet. Smiling shyly, he tentatively approached where she was seated at the bar guzzling sake as if it were going out of style and carefully sat down on the stool next to her, trying to gauge her mood and the likelihood of her taking him up on an offer of a game of cards or something rather than pounding him in the dirt. After settling onto his bar stool, he ordered a drink to steady his nerves. Noticing that Tsunade's bottle was nearly empty, he offered to order her a drink as well. Not interested, Tsunade said. What? He asked. Whatever it is you're after, I'm not interested, Tsunade said. Tenzo growled in frustration. After coming all of this way, and suffering the things that he had suffered, there was no way in hell he was going to take not interested for an answer. He had to get that necklace and he would do so if it was the last thing he did. Naruto frowned as he watched Sakura practically molest a resisting Sasuke at the end of their mission. Not only had the girl refused to help with the weeding because she hadn't wanted to get her hands dirty, but she had constantly fussed over Sasuke, whose body language had practically screamed "get lost" the entire time. No matter how much he tried, Sakura hadn't listened to him, and continued to behave in a manner he found increasingly more annoying with each passing day as he found himself constantly comparing this Sakura with her older self, who was a much better ninja, and an all-round better person. He'd told the girl repeatedly since day one that Sasuke didn't like her actions, and wouldn't be interested in her if she kept pretending to be useless when he knew for a fact that she wasn't, as he'd been on the receiving end of her blows enough times. The girl hadn't listened to him though, and if anything her behavior had gotten worse. With the way things were going, he guessed that it would take a serious wake-up call to get through to the girl the way the Chunin exams had done the last time around. It was possible that the fast-approaching mission to Wave would do the trick. Getting the mission shouldn't be all that difficult considering how he'd gotten it the last time, and the dates of that mission had been seared into his memory long ago, as had the dates of just about every major tragedy or disaster in his life. So, who wants to get a drink to celebrate another successful mission? He said cheerfully after dismissing his irritation at Sakura, as it was non-productive. He'd asked the question as soon as they were out of Kakashi's hearing range after each of the D-rank missions they completed, and so far none of his teammates had taken him up on the offer. After asking the question so many times and receiving negative responses each time, asking had become more of a habit than a genuine offer. Like they'd even let us in, moron. For the last time, stop asking, Sakura yelled and attempted to hit him as she did almost every time he asked. She'd stopped it like they'd even let us in, moron. The first time he'd asked and stopped asking. After the second. From her tone, he could tell that her response had become as routine as his invitation. More's the pity, since he was reasonably certain that Sakura would have a good time if she went for a drink with him once, as ninja bars weren't all about drinking and more than a few establishments had easily throwable and easily breakable furniture and one bar had afternoon tournaments that were popular with the local chunin. Such group activities could only improve their teamwork, and if Sasuke had better ties to the village, he'd probably be less inclined to destroy it later on. He was halfway to his new home when he was waylaid by Sasuke. Much to his surprise, it had been because Sasuke had actually finally decided to take him up on his offer. Why, he had absolutely no idea. So, how exactly are we going to get into the bar? Sasuke asked in a conspiratorial tone, or at least one that was conspiratorial for him. Meet me in the alley behind the restaurant with the giant chicken on it at 8, and I'll show you. He said. He hadn't known why the restaurant had a statue of a giant chicken on it considering the fact that that was the one type of meat that wasn't on the menu, until Erosenin had told him when they had returned from their 3-year training trip. Apparently, the chicken or rooster rather, was the symbol of a former shinobi clan that had fought alongside some seriously vicious roosters the way the Inuzuka fought alongside their dogs that had opted to go into the food service industry instead of joining the ninja ranks after the founding of Konoha. Since they'd been a low-tier clan and much better at cooking than fighting, it hadn't been all that great of a loss as far as the shinobi forces were concerned. Out of respect for their former comrades, chicken was the one food that the clan refused to either serve or eat. Much to his surprise, Sasuke was actually waiting for him when he arrived at their rendezvous spot. Despite the fact that Sasuke constantly smelled faintly of alcohol for some strange reason that he hadn't been able to discern, going to a bar seemed as out of character for the boy as cross-dressing did. Today, the Uchiha boy would be doing both. After teaching Sasuke the clothed version of the sexy jutsu, they headed off to a shinobi bar that he knew had a good enough reputation for being calm, quiet, and most of all relaxing, since he didn't want to start off with too much too soon, and Sasuke might be driven off by some of the rowdier places he himself was fond of. The owners of this particular establishment didn't overprice or water down the drinks, the bartenders weren't too surly, the bouncers didn't carry sharpened weapons, the seats and tables didn't have unidentifiable sticky spots on them or worse sticky spots that were identifiable and made you regret knowing what they were, and everything was bolted down so you didn't have to worry about getting hit by flying furniture during a bar fight. Flying drinks, however, were another matter. When the drinks he ordered for them, a potent beverage from grass that was called whiskey, arrived, he noticed that Sasuke didn't wince at the taste and didn't show any indication that he was hiding such a wince, indicating that this wasn't Sasuke's first experience with drinking alcohol. This of course was rather disturbing since Sasuke was a real 12-year-old as opposed to a time-traveling 17-year-old who'd spent a few years with a borderline alcoholic in a 12-year-old's body. It also explained why Sasuke had constantly smelled faintly of a brand of alcohol that he'd associated with cooking, despite the fact that Sasuke didn't seem to know all that much about cooking and didn't appear to enjoy the dishes it was commonly used in. being perpetually hungover could also go a long way towards explaining the Uchiha boy's attitude as well. "You know, it's never a good idea to drink alone," he said to the boy as he mentally kicked himself for not spotting Sasuke's apparent problem before. Sasuke seemed to ignore his advice as usual as he gestured for another drink, without asking why he would say something like that or even making a sound of acknowledgement of his comment for that matter. Against his better judgment, he allowed the boy to order another drink and another and another. As he would discover several drinks later, rather than being one of those people who got angry when intoxicated, Sasuke turned out to be one of the worst sort of drunk for a ninja to be. He was the sort that started crying and spilling anything they were thinking about at that particular moment, including his entire life story. During the course of the evening, he learned several things that he never knew about his teammate, and they were that he hadn't imagined in association with Sasuke and had wished that he'd never learned, including the reason Sasuke really didn't like fangirls. Sasuke's aloofness and seeming indifference towards members of the opposite sex hadn't entirely been caused by the Uchiha massacre, though the massacre had been the incident that had set off part of it. He knew that in the other timeline, girls his and Sasuke's age had practically tried to molest the boy and that girls that were a little older had been slightly more aggressive in their pursuit of the Uchiha heir, but he had no idea it had been this bad. When people thought of that kind of thing happening, they usually pictured males doing it. He himself had had an experience with a caretaker gone bad when he was a child, but not to the extent Sasuke had apparently suffered, since that particular caretaker had been discovered and executed before there could be a second incident. Apparently, Sasuke had managed to get a couple of genin teams with some of the more aggressive pursuers on them as babysitters long before he was old enough to start thinking about such things, as well as 2 live-in caretakers who had decided to take their dislike for the former Uchiha clan out on him in small ways such as forgetting to feed him on occasion, and 1 caretaker who'd turned out to be an aggressive pursuer with a taste for paralyzing drugs. Now that he'd seen under the surface of the Sasuke worship that had been going on after the massacre, he could see why Sasuke had been so willing to leave Konoha the last time around. Iruka had recently become obsessed with pedophiles for some strange reason. Maybe he should point him towards some real ones as well as a few child abusers. With his mind made up, he escorted Sasuke to his apartment and headed out to Iruka's place. Yumino Iruka finds real pedophiles this time. Blazed across the front of the Konoha Times 2 mornings after the bar incident. Upon reading it, Sasuke was relieved that his name had been left out of the article entirely. He'd appeared in the newspaper's gossip column often enough already, and he didn't need to see his name associated with something that would most assuredly garner him even more pity, and give his fangirls more reason to want to fix him. He wasn't entirely sure whether or not he regretted going to the bar with his teammate because he'd run out of booze, but, considering the result, he couldn't exactly complain. He'd woken the morning before with a massive hangover and the overwhelming realization that he'd told Naruto things he'd sworn never to tell anyone. That evening, he learned about the earlier commotion near the local jail. Apparently, his former academy instructor had rounded up all 3 of the women who had abused him while they were supposed to be watching him, as well as a couple of the former genin who had done the same while they were supposed to be looking after him while his caretakers were away, and turned them over to the ANBU TNI division early in the morning after his trip to the bar with Naruto. The interrogations had been short, and all 3 women and both teenagers who were now fast approaching adulthood, but legally adults since they were shinobi, had been sent over to the jail before the end of training that day. He'd been called to the Hokage's office to give a formal report that afternoon, and had been informed that he would not be forced to give testimony in front of a full tribunal since the women had already confessed to abusing some civilian children that they had been tending to as well as him, so his name could be kept out of the investigation if he so chose. The commotion at the jail had been made by the angry parents of the civilian children who were calling for execution in this case, as in the case of the orphanage staff worker who had abused his charges 7 years ago. After such a trying day, he had naturally used the only method he'd found that kept the nightmares away, the method he'd learned when his first caretaker after the massacre had made him drink until he passed out because she didn't want to have to listen to his screaming. As a consequence, he would be nursing yet another hangover throughout today as well. Koharu felt sick as she read the report on the Uchiha boy. 2 of the child's caretakers had gone days at a time without feeding the child who hadn't yet known how to fend for himself in that area, and one of them turned out to be sexually abusive, and she had allowed that to happen. She had thought his constant requests for new caretakers had been because he was a spoiled brat with impossible standards, and had allowed them to be treated accordingly. If she had known what was really going on, no child deserved this, not even the child of a pair of traitors to the village. Despite the fact that she didn't want to think such things of her old friend whom she'd grown up with, she had a feeling that Tenzo had something to do with this, if only it was just knowing what was going on and allowing it to continue. The man had a vested interest in the boy, and therefore would have had extensive intelligence on who was caring for him. To allow those caregivers to be turned loose amongst the civilian populace after they were dismissed from their positions in the Uchiha household was unconscionable, and definitely not in the best interests of the village which Tenzo claimed to espouse. She knew that the Hokage was not at fault in this incident, as the only orphan that the Hokage currently dealt with directly was the Jinchuriki Naruto. All others, even the last Uchiha, had a special committee to deal with their needs, and the sad truth was that Tenzo most likely had his fingers in that committee as he did almost everything else. There had been things she would side with Tenzo on over her teammate and Hokage, trusting that he had Konoha's best interests in mind. There had been things she had thought Tenzo more capable of dealing with because she believed her longtime friend to be too soft-hearted to deal with them properly, such as the betrayal of the Uchiha who themselves had been planning to betray the village, but not anymore. If Tenzo could knowingly allow even one of Konoha's children to be abused in such a manner on his watch for a reason that was completely non-productive, there was no telling what the man would be willing to do to Konoha as a whole. Chapter 8, Lectures and Impromptu History Lessons. The Hokage sighed as he read the reports on his desk. Koharu had come to him earlier with her suspicions in regards to Tenzo, and he'd been disturbed to find his teammates' concerns about their childhood friend to be plausible. He couldn't quite believe that Tenzo would allow such harm to come to the children of the village that he claimed to serve the best interests of, especially since it was completely unnecessary at best and counterproductive at worst, and none of the children were root recruits. And, if these reports in front of him were correct, the blame for the abuse of the Uchiha boy wouldn't land in Tenzo's lap. An external and apparently long overdue investigation of the special council that handled the affairs of the local orphans had revealed rife corruption that had gone on under his nose for years, if not decades. Contrary to the neatly typed quarterly reports he had been given to look over 4 times a year, the orphans who weren't recruited to be soldiers en route were quite likely to receive substandard care from people who had little to no investigation done into their backgrounds, making it almost better for the children to end up en route rather than remain in the orphanages that had steadily gone downhill over the years as staff turnover remained high due to the poor pay. To make matters worse, the Orphan Council had also robbed the coffers in a most creative manner, cooking the books so thoroughly that they were nearly burnt, making it so that those who truly cared for their charges were unable to properly take care of them because of a lack of proper funding. Several years ago, he'd been assured that the incident that had happened with Naruto was an isolated one, that none of the other children had been in danger from the man who had decided to take his frustrations out on the demon, but that apparently wasn't the case. The incident regarding the Uchiha child that probably wouldn't have come to anyone's attention if Naruto hadn't had a mischievous streak a mile wide and gotten the boy drunk had revealed that the incident that had caused Naruto's permanent removal from the orphanage hadn't been as isolated as he'd been led to believe. He hadn't personally dealt with any of Konoha's orphans other than Naruto and Iruka, who had been left at his parents' house with a caretaker who dropped by to deliver meals since the boy was nearly an academy graduate at the time he'd been orphaned, for years. Other than Naruto's orphanage, which he hadn't seen in 7 years, he had not toured any of the facilities where such children had been kept since his responsibilities as Hokage, Naruto, and his grandson had kept him much too busy, and he hadn't been given any reason to believe that the Orphan Council hadn't been doing their jobs. This situation was far worse than when the academy instructor Mizuki had turned traitor, and the damage that had been done in this situation was most likely irreparable in many cases. And, it was partially his fault since he hadn't been keeping an eye on it like he should have been. After signing the orders for the ANBU to conduct raids on every last one of those facilities, and for the TNI division to personally vet any and every person who dealt with the children living in those orphanages on a daily basis, he turned to the next request on his desk. Sighing, he signed Iruka's request to teach a special class on identifying a certain type of predator, wishing that it hadn't been necessary. Naruto had been curious when his team as well as teams 8 and 10 had been called back to the academy. After he'd arrived, he'd been positively mortified because he'd been forced to sit through a long lecture about the bad kind of touching and how to spot the warning signs when dealing with the sort of person that preyed on children. He'd squirmed when all eyes turned to him after the lecture. It seemed that there had been some rumors going around amongst his peers. Iruka's irrational behavior towards his Jonin instructor and his godfather hadn't helped matters any. "What?" he finally yelled. "Well, Naruto," Hinata said shyly, apparently unable to form much less finish her sentence. "If you're asking what I think you're asking about, the reason Kakashi-sensei's been hugging me all the time and giving me presents is most likely because he feels guilty that he's been living his own life instead of looking after me like he felt my parents would have wanted him to do, forgetting that I already had a godfather who should have been taking care of me himself, and that they wouldn't have expected a 14-year-old to take care of a baby. The reason I haven't been living with Erosenin all along is because he's been away the last 12 years peeking into women's baths, writing perverted books, and keeping track of a child-murdering freak," he said, hoping that he'd cleared up some of the misunderstandings that had apparently been circulating. Several jaws dropped at this. "Child-murdering freak?" Inuzuka Kiba asked. "Yeah, the guy's name is Orochimaru. He was one of the legendary Sannin and Erosenin's former teammate. He kidnaps kids and uses them in his twisted experiments, where he turns them into freaky mutants if he doesn't kill them outright. He ran away from Konoha after they found about 100 dead kids in his lab, some of whom had even been dissected. Erosenin fought him when he ran and lost. Erosenin then decided to keep track of him as best as he could after that since he'd never been able to defeat him in open battle, and the bastard had threatened to destroy Konoha when he left. Since he didn't seem to be doing anything but sitting in his new lab for the last year or so, Erosenin decided it was safe to come back for a while until he gets news that the bastard has gone on the move again," he said. Of all the horrified stares that surrounded him, the most important one was Sasuke's unsurprisingly well-disguised one. If Sasuke had known what Orochimaru was beforehand, he probably never would have joined him. At least that's what he believed of the Sasuke he knew, the Sasuke who had been his teammate, and had taken what had seemed to be a death blow for him, the Sasuke who, despite all that happened to him, still had a little bit of a heart left, the Sasuke whose eyes had not yet died, the Sasuke who had spared him at the Valley of the End when he could have easily killed him while he was unconscious, the Sasuke who still knew that sometimes power came at too great a price. He would do anything and everything in his power to make sure that his Sasuke didn't vanish again. If warning him about Orochimaru helped, he would post a sign 100 miles high. Tenzo was sore and exhausted by the time he reached the gates of Konoha. He had taken the most direct route and still ended up suffering through a couple interesting misadventures that he planned to do his utmost to forget entirely. He looked over his shoulder once more when he thought he'd felt an out-of-place presence. Once again there was nothing, just like the last time he looked. That didn't necessarily mean that nobody was there though. He had a sneaking suspicion that Tsunade had followed him home waiting for him to drop dead, because she was just a little too honorable to knock him out and take her necklace back despite her numerous other faults. After all, he'd won it fair and square. He'd finally won the necklace in a 20-hour poker game that emptied her ready cash resources and damn near doubled her personal gambling debt before she had finally and rather reluctantly put up her necklace. Giving a wan smile to the guard on duty, he signed in and headed to his apartment, tripping over the black cat that had been wandering around the village for as long as he could remember and somehow landing headfirst in a metal trash can full of things he really didn't want to think about, which he promptly knocked over along with the other cans in the row on his way. This had become par for the course, as the return trip home had been constantly been like this. He couldn't wait to be rid of the necklace which he would be giving to Naruto tomorrow. For now though, he would be doing his best to clean himself off and getting some sleep. Sasuke sat across from a massive man named Jiraiya at the dinner table in Naruto's new apartment, wondering yet again why he'd come. After the lecture that had brought up a number of issues that he didn't want to deal with, Naruto had invited him over for dinner. Based on the boy's expression and the late hour of the meal, it seemed as if Naruto knew exactly how he was going to be getting to sleep that night, and wanted to make sure he didn't drink alone, or at all for that matter. He wasn't quite sure why he had accepted the invitation, since he generally tried to avoid getting close to anyone because everyone he'd gotten close to had hurt him somehow, even if it was simply by dying. That, and he was afraid of being tempted to kill someone he was close to get the Mangekyo Sharingan as his brother had instructed. Naruto was in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on the dinner he'd made because apparently, if the Uzumaki was to be believed, Jiraiya's cooking was something to be dreaded far more than that of a ramen-obsessed 12-year-old, and Naruto had wanted to spare him from the horrors of it. As he waited for Naruto to finish, he noticed several photographs that had been put up on the wall in what looked like a place of honor. One of the photographs was his team photo with Kakashi hugging a squirming Naruto in the middle, and him and Sakura off to either side. The photo to the left of it was of a blonde-haired man with blue eyes standing behind an ill-tempered Kakashi, a girl that may or may not have been an Inuzuka, and a cheerful-looking boy in orange goggles who was chewing on a senbon, with one hand on either boy's head. To the left of that was a picture of a much younger Jiraiya standing next to a boy with fluffy blonde hair that stuck out everywhere and blue eyes, and two other dark-haired children who were looking away from the camera. The picture to the left of that one was of a rather young-looking third Hokage standing behind a Jiraiya that was about half his age, a little blonde girl with brown eyes, and an oddly pale little boy with long black hair that had been left loose and gotten into his face. Before he could ask about the pictures that were obviously all team photos, Naruto said a meal that consisted mainly of tomatoes that had been prepared in several different ways before him. "I heard you like tomatoes," Naruto said by way of explanation before he set a similar plate of food in front of Jiraiya. Sure, he liked tomatoes, they were his second favorite food, but this was a bit much. As he picked at his meal, Jiraiya tried to engage him in conversation. Jiraiya, it seemed, had noticed him looking at the photos while they were waiting for their meal and had decided to tell him about them over dinner. "You obviously know about your team photo," Jiraiya said. "The one next to yours is Team Minato. My old student Minato was their instructor." Kakashi was already a chunin when Minato had the two genin added so Kakashi could learn to interact with kids his own age. The boy in the goggles was named Obito, he died during the war. He was a cousin of yours, if I remember correctly. He used to always show up late to just about everything, mostly because he was training or rather playing with your brother Itachi. I heard that the poor boy didn't speak for over a month after Obito died. The girl's name was Noera Rin. She was a medic who was killed during a battle with a large number of ninja from Kiri. The picture next to that is the team I trained," Jiraiya continued. "The blonde, as you can tell, was Minato. The other two died at the beginning of the Third Shinobi War. The picture next to that is my old genin team. There's me, Hiruzen-sensei, Tsunade's the girl, and Orochimaru's the creepy-looking boy. Tsunade became one of the best medic nin in the elemental countries, before she broke after the death of her fiancé and left. Orochimaru left Konoha after he was caught kidnapping fellow shinobi and some civilians and doing experiments on them. They found about 100 dead children in his lab, as well as a bunch more that needed to be put out of their misery because of what he'd done to them. Sasuke lost his appetite then and there. Naruto had told him about Orochimaru earlier after Iruka had dragged them all back to the academy for a lecture on sexual abuse and the various ways that pedophiles trick children into certain situations. A lecture he hadn't needed, since he'd already experienced it. Jiraiya observed the rather bored-looking Uchiha, whose eyes were wandering around the dining area. He'd never really known the boy as he'd not been close to Fugaku or Makoto, had been away from Konoha for most of the boy's life, and he hadn't really interacted with the Uchiha after he'd returned. He'd heard about him from Naruto, who had vowed to bring him back from the clutches of his former teammate, but it was all general stuff that everybody knew, and it didn't give him a clear image of the child Naruto seemed to regard as a brother. Seeing that the boy had taken an interest in the team photos that he and Naruto had put up on the wall when they moved in, he decided to give him some history about them and some information about Orochimaru so he wouldn't be going into the deal blind as he seemed to have the last time, thinking he could use the snake to get the power he needed to get his revenge. That had been a rather half-baked plan that had backfired and cost the boy and Konoha dearly. The boy had lost his body, and the village had been destroyed. When dinner was served, the Uchiha boy picked at his meal, which was rather surprising since he heard that tomatoes were his favorite food, and Naruto was an excellent cook despite his age and propensity for instant ramen. Something was obviously wrong with the boy. Naruto probably knew what was going through the boy's mind, since he knew him much better than he did. He would ask him later. Deciding to enjoy his meal and shelve the enigma that was Uchiha Sasuke for now, he went back to his food. Kakashi sat in his room thinking as he munched on a ration bar since he couldn't be bothered to cook that evening. He'd been forced to rethink what he knew about the Uchiha brat. If it had been any other child, a child that didn't have a trauma like the massacre in his past, he probably would have noticed the signs, and would have interrogated any other child about possible abuse if they displayed the behavior that boy did. After the arrests that made Iruka the hero of the hour, he had taken to observing the little traitor. What he saw surprised him. He couldn't believe that he'd missed this the last time around, especially considering the fact that he'd taken the brat for a month of one-on-one training. The kid was an alcoholic. The boy had drank himself to sleep every night he'd observed him. This wasn't exactly a unique occurrence, even though laws had been put in place in hopes of preventing it. There had been more than a few alcoholics in his age group when he was the traitor's age, children who had started drinking either because it had been forbidden or in imitation of the adults around them and didn't stop as it had become a crutch that helped them avoid their problems, children who couldn't deal with the life they led and the war they were forced to fight. He might have become one of them himself if it hadn't been for Minato-sensei, and if he had, he would have been just another statistic by now since the ones who had turned to alcohol to deal with their problems had almost invariably died far too young. A person couldn't afford to make mistakes or have their senses dulled in any way in their profession. Doing so would be inviting death, which was probably why many of the older shinobi drank the way they did. After learning of the Uchiha boy's problem, he investigated as to how the boy was getting his supply. Apparently, the clerk at the nearby liquor store had believed the Uchihas I'm running an errand for story every time since the brat had taken to purchasing cooking alcohol rather than the more common brands that kids tended to try to get their hands on, and this had been going on for a couple of years. Upon learning this, he'd set the clerk straight and alerted the managers of every other store in the area that Uchiha Sasuke wasn't allowed to buy alcohol from them until he reached the age at which civilians attained majority, which was 18. Hopefully by then, he would have found a way to deal with the problem and the Uchiha would have been weaned of his addiction. He didn't know how he was going to get the Uchiha boy to stop drinking, but he was sure he'd be able to find a way. Perhaps he should look into asking Jiraiya about some seals. Chapter 9, Wave and Tsunade's Necklace. Kakashi wondered at the strange feeling of déjà vu he had gotten when Naruto threw a fit after they had finished capturing that mangy cat Tora, who would be some other team's problem as soon as its owner's back was turned. Naruto rarely behaved like that this time around since he was actually getting positive attention and therefore didn't need to behave like a brat just to get people to interact with him, and he couldn't see why he was doing so now. He'd never really complained about the D ranks that the team had been placed on this time around, and seemed happy to be doing them as long as they didn't involve hunting felines that were on the lam. When he pulled out of his musings on Naruto's odd behavior, it was to find that Iruka was giving Naruto a rather familiar lecture on how missions were handed out and why he wasn't going to get anything better than AD rank for a while, somehow managing to glare at him as if he thought that he was the one to blame for Naruto's regression throughout the entire lecture. The lecture ended when the Hokage cut Iruka off by saying the team could have AC-ranked mission. He tried to push down the rising sense of dread that seemed to have come out of nowhere at the Hokage's declaration. A nice C-ranked mission would give Naruto a chance to stretch his legs and test his skills a bit while exploring a new environment. There was no reason to think they would get the same C rank twice, even if the thrice-damned mission to Wave had begun sometime around this time of this particular month the last time. Ruffling Naruto's hair fondly, he accepted the C rank. He stopped smiling behind his mask and his hand slid numbly to his side when the door slid open, revealing the absolute last person he had wanted to see. The second that drunken old bastard Tazuna showed up, he knew he should have stayed in bed today, or at the very least locked Naruto in his apartment where he'd be safe. Oh shit. He said, knowing that there was no way he and, more importantly, Naruto could get out of this now. Unless he wanted to get into serious trouble, he could not reject a mission once accepted without giving a reasonable explanation. Telling the Hokage that the man was lying about the mission's ranking, and that he knew so because he had traveled through time, would most likely result in a psych evaluation that would postpone the mission to Wave indefinitely, since time travel was something that happened in crappy novels, not real life, but it would also result in him getting his team taken away from him as well. Who knew what damage a new Jonin instructor would do to Naruto's progress, or how many more people besides Naruto would be killed by Sasuke when he decided to leave Konoha, probably much earlier this time around because his instructor didn't have a neat assassination technique to teach him or the knowledge of how to hold back the curse seal for the short time he had managed to do so when the kid had gotten it the last time around. He tried to console himself with the knowledge that Naruto had survived this mission the last time around, even though there had more close calls than he could count along the way. Actually, come to think of it, it had been the traitor Uchiha who had been the closest to being killed. Even with that warm thought though, he ended up failing as 100 doubts assailed him. Who knew what could go differently this time, especially since a little knowledge could be a dangerous thing, and if you changed one thing, you could end up changing everything. Would he act based on his memories of a fight that was somewhat fuzzy in his recollection now that he looked back on it, and change the outcome entirely, causing things to spiral out of control? Would his teaching his students something different because he'd already taught them the tree climbing exercise cause events to spiral off on a tangent that he couldn't predict? Would his students do something different because he'd treated and trained them differently, causing everything to go differently? Even if he did everything the same, there was no guarantee everything would turn out the same, and that worried him. He had to keep his team to keep Naruto safe in the future though. Right now, keeping his team meant keeping his silence for now and taking this mission despite the number of ways it could go foobar, while praying nothing went wrong this time the entire time they were gone, and turning back as soon as they faced the first of the enemy ninja, despite whatever heart-wrenching pleas the client, or former client rather, made. Naruto smiled as he prepared for the mission to Wave. He would be able to tell Sasuke the truth about the Uchiha massacre after they arrived at the small island country. When he did, Sasuke wouldn't feel guilty for killing his brother this time around, because he either wouldn't kill his brother or would do so knowing that his brother wanted to die that way rather than slowly and painfully succumbing to an illness while he just as slowly went blind. If Sasuke didn't kill his brother, he wouldn't feel as angry at Konoha, and therefore probably wouldn't desire to destroy the place despite the fact that his brother had sacrificed everything to keep it standing. He would of course have to risk telling Sasuke about his time traveling to explain how he knew everything, but he was certain Sasuke could keep a secret better than most people as long as nobody got him drunk. "So, you're going on your first C rank?" Jiraiya said, poking his head into his room and smiling rather fondly as if he were recalling a pleasant memory from his youth. The slight wince that marred the Sanin's smile for a second was him undoubtedly reaching the point in the memory where Tsunade had most likely beaten the crap out of him. Either that, or the point at which Orochimaru had shown him up somehow. Jiraiya hadn't been able to catch a break with those two, but back before Tsunade broke and Orochimaru became a total headcase after the Second War, they had been an extremely close-knit team who'd loved each other the way only family who had chosen each other could. "Yes, Erosenin," he said as he continued packing extra weapons into a storage scroll. This C rank was going to be turning into an A rank pretty quickly, and he was going to be prepared this time. Hopefully, he would still be able to do some of the S-rank jutsus he'd learned before he went time traveling. His chakra control wasn't nearly as good as it had been back then, but he still remembered how to do all of the jutsu he'd learned over the years since he was last this age. Come back safe, Jiraiya said, smiling, as he ruffled his hair before he turned to go back to writing his perverted book. Jiraiya usually did that for about half the day before he went out to train. After training, he would go to a previously agreed-upon bar to speak with one or more of his informants in order to gather intelligence on Orochimaru's movements. After staying at the bar gathering vital information for a while, he would usually either return or be dragged home in time for an exceedingly late dinner. All too soon, he'd finished packing to the sound of Jiraiya's perverted giggles. After he was reasonably certain that he had everything he needed and then some, he headed out to the gate where he was to meet the rest of his team and the old bridge builder Tazuna. Rather unexpectedly, Yamato Taicho was waiting for him at the gate, and there was a rather familiar-looking item in his hand. How in the hell did he get old lady Tsunade's necklace, and for that matter, why? Tenzo, who'd gotten a rather late start that morning after he'd fallen down a flight of stairs and hobbled to the hospital on a twisted ankle, had to practically kneel to put the first Hokage's necklace on Naruto because the boy was so short. Until now, he hadn't really realized it, but the kid had really shot up in the 3 years between now and when he first officially met him, as chasing him after some stupid prank because the police had been disbanded after the massacre didn't really count, since he'd never been the one to catch him. As he gave the boy the necklace that was rightfully his, he ignored the odd stare he was getting from Kakashi-senpai and the curious whispers that were coming from Naruto's teammates. "Now don't take this off, it's very special," he said when the boy started critically examining the necklace the instant he put it on him, most likely having serious doubts about whether or not he wanted to keep such a girly gift. He did his best not to be offended by this action though. Naruto had only started to learn proper manners rather late in life, and only then because the 5th Hokage had practically beaten them into him. "I'll tell you more, Abu," he continued, before he was blindsided by an angry Yumino Iruka. "Stay away from Naruto," the man yelled before he socked him a second time. "All right, fine, I'm leaving," he said, wanting to avoid a fight because he'd be unable to prevent Naruto from releasing the fox's power if he was put in the hospital by an overprotective Iruka. That man could pack a punch when he wanted to. He'd learned that the hard way when Naruto had offhandedly mentioned to the academy instructor that he had threatened to stick him in a cage during that rather disastrous mission where they had tried and failed to capture Sasori's spy Kabuto, who'd turned out to be a double agent in Orochimaru's camp. After Naruto had said that, Iruka hadn't waited to hear the rest of the story, which had involved him taking the team to an inn instead and had attacked him, giving him a black eye and a split lip before he could be subdued despite the fact that he outranked and was theoretically stronger and faster than the Yumino. As he left the area, he saw Iruka glaring at Kakashi-senpai, who ignored the man in favor of glaring at him, as if he'd done something wrong. He would find out why after he doubled back and followed Team Kaka, or Team 7 later. Kakashi-senpai could be pretty vicious at times, especially if you upset him for some unfathomable reason, and he wanted to get off of that man's bad side as quickly as possible as well. Tsunade watched as the young man who had tricked her into betting her necklace in a card game gave it to a boy who looked a little like a light blonde Nawaki. She had been tempted to run over to the child and snatch the necklace away before he could be killed, but hadn't. Instead, she had watched as the boy vanished into the distance with his team on their way to who knows where. She had briefly thought of following after them, of warning the child about what he possessed, but she didn't, she couldn't. She couldn't run the risk of seeing the boy die in front of her the way Dan had. Despite the fact that the child was only a few minutes away from the village, there were still numerous ways he could die. Shizune placed her hand on her shoulder in an attempt to comfort her. She knew something of what she was going through, as Dan had been her uncle. She also knew that she hated being back in Konoha, and didn't know what had possessed her to return. She herself honestly didn't know why she had continued following the man after where he was heading became obvious. As she stood there basking in the comfort her student provided, she wondered what she would have done without Shizune. Deciding to visit her former sensei before she went and got wasted so she could forget the face of the soon-to-be dead child who was making his way down the road from Konoha, she turned and made her way to the Hokage Tower. "The blonde boy that looks like Nawaki?" the Hokage asked, wondering what Tsunade wanted with the child in question. He'd been both stunned and elated when Tsunade had shown up completely unannounced. The first question she asked once the pleasantries and small talk were over confused him briefly, as there were many young children in the village that may or may not have resembled Nawaki depending what characteristics one was looking for, and several of them were blonde. "The one with the orange top with the Uzumaki clan symbol on it," Tsunade replied, clarifying who she had been indicating. "Oh, you mean Naruto," he said, wondering how she had run into the village prankster who'd apparently made some sort of an impression. "What about him?" Moments after he answered her question, something seemed to click in Tsunade's mind. A brief look of horror crossed her face before it vanished. He would have to ask her about that later. "What can you tell me about him?" Tsunade asked, trying to hide some sort of painful emotion. "Besides what you already know. He's a lot like his mother was in personality, and takes after her a bit in looks, despite having his father's coloring. He's hyperactive, likes pranks and ramen like his mother did, and is constantly telling everyone whether or not they want to hear it that he's going to be Hokage someday. I have a feeling that he might do it too. That boy never gives up when he sets his mind to something, which is both a good and a bad trait," he replied, wondering if that's what she wanted to hear. Tsunade looked sick. Before he could ask her what was wrong, she started sobbing. "Damn him. Damn him. Damn him. Damn him," Tsunade screamed. "What is it, Tsunade? What's wrong?" he asked. "Some bastard tricked me into betting my necklace in a card game recently. He just gave it to Naruto less than 2 hours ago," Tsunade replied, looking both guilty and shaken at the same time. He didn't know what to say to that. He knew that several people, including Tsunade, believed the necklace to be cursed. The last 2 people that Tsunade had given the necklace to had died soon after receiving it. Both had been close to Tsunade in some way, and both had wanted to be Hokage. If someone thought they could kill Naruto by giving him a cursed object, they had another thing coming. "Can you describe this man?" he asked as he prepared an order for an ANBU team to go out and detain this individual. Chapter 10, On the Road Again. Kakashi felt his heart leap into his throat when Naruto started stomping and splashing in the puddle the rogue mist ninja were hiding in with a mischievous look on his face. He completely ignored Sakura's loud complaints as the chakra-tainted water splashed her, as they were completely important. About ready to panic, he jumped over and grabbed the boy, pulling him away from the puddle and its surely disoriented contents before he did the substitution jutsu as he had the last time, preparing for battle. The log was killed as it had been the first time, startling Sakura, Sasuke, and Tazuna. Instead of hanging back to see who his target was and how his students would fare against the enemy, he decided to leap back into the battle almost immediately. Before he could get into the thick of things, however, Naruto was already flying towards one of the demon brothers, and the other had somehow managed to get behind him. The eyes of the ninja behind Naruto widened almost comically. "Holy shit. It's an Uzumaki!" the demon brother behind Naruto yelled. The demon brothers then did something completely unexpected which completely wrecked his attack strategy before he could implement it. They turned tail and ran, each going in opposite directions. This had been all of the opening Naruto needed apparently, as he created about 24 clones and sent them after the brothers who returned 5 minutes later unconscious, being dragged by a pair of shadow clones each. As soon as they were back in the middle of the road, Naruto's shadow clones then proceeded to strip the pair of hapless ninja down to their underwear and bind them to a nearby tree while Naruto himself proceeded to haphazardly cram their equipment into a spare storage scroll that he had happened to be carrying. "Naruto, what just happened?" he asked confused. This had definitely not happened the last time around. The last time around, Naruto had frozen up and ended up getting himself poisoned. If it hadn't been for the Kyuubi, the boy would have been dead after that attack. Another question that came up was, why were the Mist Ninja afraid of Uzumaki? And if so, why hadn't they behaved that way last time this fight happened then, if they were? I captured them. Naruto replied simply as he rolled up the now full storage scroll and put it away, both answering and not answering his question. Why'd they run like that? He asked, expecting to get a hell if I know. In reply, and wondering why he'd even bothered wasting his breath asking. It had probably been the shock of seeing Naruto single-handedly catching a pair of Chunin-level missing nin that had made him start asking stupid questions. There's been a standing flee-on-sight order in Mist regarding the entire Uzumaki clan for the last 50 years. Naruto replied, not bothering to look up at him as he was busy snapping his pack shut. I found a note on it in the library when I tried researching my family recently. He stood there dumbfounded. Why hadn't any of the Mist Ninja they'd fought fled when they had faced Naruto the last time around? What was it that had made the difference this time? It was then that he remembered. The Mist Ninja had started yelling after he'd gotten behind Naruto, after he had seen the Uzumaki clan symbol on the boy's back. The last time around, Naruto had been wearing a rather hideous jumpsuit which had the symbol for Uzumaki on it rather than the Uzumaki clan symbol. Since every Chunin and Jounin vest and numerous articles of ninja clothing in Konoha had the exact same spiral sewn onto them or incorporated into their design, the ninja would not have found Naruto's to be significant, and wouldn't understand why he was wearing it despite it being rather non-standard amongst genin who usually wore their clan markings on their clothing if any. We're turning back. This mission has gone above C rank and is beyond your abilities to handle. He finally said once he'd returned from his musings. Despite the fact that Naruto seemed to be able to handle himself, and there was a chance that the Demon of the Mist might choose to run rather than fight this time, he wasn't going to risk it. They were going to turn around before Tazuna started on his sob story and reeled Naruto in. He would probably feel guilty for a long time for allowing Gato to keep his stranglehold on Wave, but he'd feel even guiltier if he let Naruto get hurt. In the balance between virtual strangers and his sensei's son, Naruto came first. No. Naruto howled, his blue eyes flashing in anger in a manner that was reminiscent of his father, despite his response being more something his mother would do. We started this mission and we have to finish it. Besides, I defeated these guys all by myself. And, what if we end up facing a much stronger opponent? He asked, hoping that the boy would see his logic. If they're from Mist, it probably wouldn't matter. Naruto replied, smirking at having come up with an appropriate comeback. Point taken. He said, knowing that he'd end up losing this argument with Naruto like this as he was as persistent as both of his parents combined, and he'd never won an argument with Minato-sensei. The swordsman Momochi Zabuza had been from Mist, and even missing nin tended to follow flee-on-sight orders since they knew that they were put in place for a reason. But, there was still the possibility that the Momochi could harm Naruto before he even noticed that he was an Uzumaki. Then, on the other hand, there was the fact that Naruto had survived the last time around. That, and he probably wouldn't forgive him if he ever learned that he'd had the chance to save a whole bunch of people and hadn't been able to because he'd been turned back by an overprotective teacher. He knew full well that he wouldn't be able to stand looking into Minato-sensei's disappointed blue eyes every day for years, even if they were in someone else's face. He would just have to make sure that Naruto wasn't injured, even if it meant locking him in a trunk at the first available opportunity. Great, he'd just done all of Naruto's arguing for him, and the kid still won. Fine, I'll just send a message back to Konoha informing them of our prisoners and we'll move out. He said, defeated. If he'd known that signing up for the Tora capture mission in the hopes that the Uchiha would be scratched to hell and back by the damn beast when he was forced to carry it back to the Hokage Tower would result in this, he'd have taken that babysitting job that involved the pair of brats that had sent the last 10 of their babysitters running for the hills instead. Naruto smiled as they set off down the road to Wave. Instead of panicking, freezing up, getting poisoned, panicking again and cutting his own hand open, he had handled himself admirably. That, and the irrational fear that the mist had towards the Uzumaki who had become some sort of bogeyman to them over the years was finally working out for him. The last time around, he'd somehow been marked down as not an Uzumaki, and the flee-on-sight order had been disregarded in his case. It probably had something to do with the fact that he'd generally been the loser in the fights he'd had with the few shinobi from Mist that he had faced, hadn't killed his other opponents in a creative and rather embarrassing manner, sucked at seals, and didn't have the dark red hair that had been the trademark of the Uzumaki for generations. Whistling, he made his way over to Tazuna. He was planning on asking him about the conditions in Wave so the others could be informed, since Kakashi hadn't interrogated him this time around, and therefore hadn't forced him to spill his sad tale. "Are you really an Uzumaki?" Tazuna asked, looking at him strangely. "Yep, on my mother's side," he replied cheerfully. He'd initially been resentful of the possible implication that he had been a bastard, but, since he learned who his father was, and how the little ruse had kept his father's enemies, especially almost the whole of IWA, from pounding him into the dirt or killing him, he'd become much less so. That, and he was still a bit pissed at his father for sealing that damn fox inside him. Forgiven didn't exactly mean forgotten. "You don't have a weird obsession with sticking things up people's butts, do you?" Tazuna asked, still giving him that strange look. "No, why?" he asked, completely puzzled by the question. After all, why would he be obsessed with sticking things up people's butts? He wasn't a pervert of any sort. Well, not much of one at least. The Oiroke Jutsu was an anti-pervert move. Honest. Tazuna looked immensely relieved by his response. A moment later, he started mumbling something under his breath. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Thanking the gods that you take after your father's side of the family," Tazuna replied. "You sent him where?" Jiraiya said, almost unable to believe his ears. He'd interrupted his writing to come to the Hokage's office because his former sensei had sent him a message indicating that something might be wrong with his godson. When he arrived, he learned that things weren't going as well as they could have been and Naruto had yet again been sent on that A-rank mission that had been disguised as a C-rank. On a mission to guard a bridge builder from Wave from bandits. The Hokage replied calmly after briefly looking at his notes. Despite the fact that he'd wished for the answer to change, it had been what he'd heard the first time. Due to some extremely bad luck and factors he'd had no control over, the boy had been sent on a mission that had greatly traumatized him the last time around, again. If he knew that it would even have been possible after all of the little changes that had been made, he would have gone out looking for that damned bridge builder and turned him away from Konoha or gone to Wave and dealt with things himself. It had never really occurred to him that the changes he'd made had mostly been local, and wouldn't really have had all that much effect on things that were outside of the village, except that an informant that had been killed shortly after meeting with him the last time around had survived because that particular meeting had never taken place. What bearing would Naruto no longer living in a crap heap of an apartment, Naruto getting attention from Kakashi, Iruka becoming paranoid about pedophiles and eventually catching a few, the other Jonin believing the Uchiha might be a danger to their students and refusing joint training exercises for that reason rather than because Naruto was on the team really have on when an old man in another country decides to set out in an attempt to get some ninja on the cheap so he could complete a bridge that a shipping magnate was attempting to prevent since it would cut into his profits? Any one of the Genin teams or even a team of Chunin could have drawn that mission. It was just Naruto's bad luck that he'd been there at the right place at the right time once more, and he would just have to hope that the mission went the same as it had the last time around, or a bit better, and be there for Naruto when he returned. There was little else he could do really since he was already a day behind them, and would be extremely late to any of the battles they would face on the road to Wave. Tenzo gaped at the pair of missing nin that had been tied to a rather large oak, wearing only their headbands, underwear, and socks. Since he was less than an hour behind Team 7, whatever battle these shinobi had fought and apparently lost had taken place recently. Since there wasn't any blood on the ground, He could only conclude that besides the mist ninja who were bound to the tree apologizing profusely and thanking somebody for something, nobody had been injured. "What happened to you?" he asked. "We dared to go up against an Uzumaki," they said. "And?" he asked. "Uzumaki-sama was merciful. He only stripped us and robbed us," the one on the left said. Tenzo could only stare after that proclamation. Naruto had stripped them and robbed them, and they considered that merciful? When the men had gone back to apologizing for every bad thing they had ever done and swearing that they wouldn't do it again, he was back on more familiar ground. Naruto could get a mass murderer to change his ways in under an hour. He seemed to have set a new personal record with these guys though. Chapter 11, Missing Meds in an Anticlimactic Battle. The boat trip to Wave was pretty much the same as he remembered it being the last time. Sasuke, who was probably going through withdrawal rather than being hung over since Kakashi had confiscated all of his alcohol, was staring out at the mist as if it had personally insulted him. Sakura was trying to rub up against Sasuke, who kept pushing her away. Kakashi was reading one of his favorite novels in the Ika Ika series, and quietly giggling at the particularly dirty parts. And Tazuna was afterwards quietly chatting with the skipper who was quietly rowing the boat towards the shore. Since the motor would have been too loud. There was one small problem with him himself, however. A problem he'd noticed the morning after they'd left Konoha. A problem he'd completely overlooked until he'd mentally reviewed his day, wondering why he'd had the nagging feeling that something was missing. Kakashi had forgotten his pills this time around, which was bad, since if the meds in his system slipped below a certain level, they'd completely clear out of his system far more quickly than normal, causing a large number of problems. Remembering the disaster that had occurred when Jiraiya had decided he didn't need the medication he'd been taking since before he could remember during their training trip, he hoped that it wouldn't turn out to be a complete disaster. They couldn't afford one considering what would be happening soon. By this point, the medication in his bloodstream had slipped well below therapeutic levels, and he was already beginning to feel the results. The worse-than-usual twitchiness, which was the first sign that things would be going south soon, had already started. He felt like he had a lot more energy than usual, and he was rapidly losing focus as just about everything from the way the boatman smelled to the cry of the gull wheeling overhead caught his attention. If things went the way they had the last time he'd been off his meds, he'd literally be bouncing off the walls, unable to focus on anything for more than 2 seconds by midday tomorrow, if not sooner. Back before, old lady Tsunade had once told him that he suffered from what appeared to be an extremely severe form of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder that had most likely been caused by the much larger than usual amounts of chakra in his system, thanks to the tenet in his belly that gave him more energy in a minute than a normal person had in a month. The meds had helped keep this under control to the degree that, while he was on them, he appeared to suffer from a normal case of ADHD that had gone untreated. Without the meds, however, he hoped there was a pharmacy in Wave, otherwise, Kakashi and the rest of the team were in for an interesting time. Kakashi had been quietly reading when Tazuna had made a comment that heralded disaster. "What's wrong with him?" Tazuna asked as he gestured to a rather squirmier than usual Naruto. He looked at his watch. Was it already that late? Damn, the kid should have had his meds hours ago. Come to think of it, when was the last time he'd given the boy his meds? Reaching into a specific pocket on his vest, he pulled out a small pill bottle. It was empty. That's right, he'd planned to go to the pharmacy for a refill, but they'd got the mission to Wave and he'd been too distracted thinking of the many ways it could go wrong to do so. Iruka had told him not to cut it so close with Naruto's meds and to get a refill when there were 15 pills left in the bottle, but he just didn't listen. "Aw shit," he said as he remembered what Naruto was like before he'd started the meds. Kakashi nervously followed the nurse down the corridors of the hospital. As he did so, he wondered why he had the gall to think that he would succeed where medical professionals with decades of experience had failed. It was probably because he had actually cared about Naruto's fate, and the hospital staff had only been caring for the boy because the Hokage had ordered them to do so. "He's in here." the nurse said as she opened a heavy steel door, revealing a thickly padded room. A bright yellow blur that he'd been assured was really a 2-year-old boy flashed by, appearing to be moving somewhere near the speed of light. The blur, or rather boy in question, was bouncing off of every wall of the padded room, including the floor and ceiling, faster than even his Sharingan eye could track. His mission was to get this kid to sit still long enough to swallow the pill that one of the doctors had provided, since all other methods of administering medication to the child had failed. Naruto had absolutely refused to get within 15 feet of a needle after he'd been caught in a net by a hunter nin who'd been hired for the occasion, and given his vaccination several months ago, and had been far too young for this particular medication at that time. Adding to the problem was the fact that the child always seemed to know when the food given to him was laced with sedatives, and would accordingly refuse to eat it. After Naruto had gotten rather dangerously thin, the hospital's medical staff had been forced to cease their attempts at sedation. If he failed in this task, Minato-sensei's son, who seemed to live up to the name Yellow Flash without using special seals, would probably be forced to live in that padded room for the rest of his short life, which the doctors had informed the Hokage wouldn't last longer than a few more years if he continued the way he was going, since the human body couldn't handle the stress that the boy was putting it through, even with the freakish healing and regenerative abilities he had. The doctors and nurses had attempted to administer medication to Naruto while he was asleep, but the boy only slept for about a minute at a time before he started bouncing off the walls for hours on end, as he had been doing ever since he learned to walk once more. By the time the hospital staff reached the room with the child's medication, Naruto would have already woken up, and was damn near impossible to catch while he was awake. The hunter nin who'd used the net in order to capture Naruto so he could receive his vaccinations was on medical leave for mental health reasons, since he'd been unable to do anything other than sit in a corner and rock back and forth after that mission. If the rumors he'd heard were true, Naruto's eyes had turned red and the boy had grown claws and fangs, which he had then used to bite and scratch the hell out of the poor man when he turned the child loose in his room after the vaccinations had been administered. Nobody else had been able to hold on to the child long enough to administer medication, much less catch him in a net as the hunter nin had done since then. The one who'd come closest to doing so had been Marino Ibiki during the infamous stuffed duck incident 2 months ago, and he had ended up coming away from said incident with a large number of nasty-looking scratches on his arms that looked like they were going to scar. Because of that, Jiraiya had been ordered to clearly label all of Naruto's birthday presents as such and send them through the mail properly in order to prevent another misunderstanding such as the one that had led to the stuffed duck incident from occurring. He hoped his plan worked. Otherwise, the doctors and maybe even the Hokage would give up hope of the child that Minato-sensei had sacrificed so much for ever living anything approaching a normal life. After watching the boy bounce off the walls for over an hour, he was reasonably certain that he'd found a pattern in the boy's movements. Hoping that he was correct and that neither he nor the boy suffered any broken bones or other injuries as a result of bringing the child to such an abrupt halt from the speed he'd been moving at, he moved to knock the boy out of the air. Upon landing on the floor, Naruto was stunned for a second. It was all the time he needed. He pinned the boy and forced him to swallow the pill he'd been given. Before the child could spit it up, he shoved a chocolate into the boy's mouth and hoped he didn't choke. That apparently did the trick, since the boy became busy chewing and swallowing the chocolate, completely forgetting about the pill. After a while, the medication seemed to take effect. Naruto's bouncing became much slower than it had been before. Instead of being somewhere near the speed of light, he looked to be traveling at about the speed of sound. He probably wasn't though, since there weren't any sonic booms. After his initial success, he got called in every morning for the next week to give the child his medication. By the time it had reached what the doctors had determined to be therapeutic levels, Naruto was merely moving at the rate of an overly hyperactive toddler and actually sleeping for hours at a time rather than minutes. Fortunately, considering the young age at which Naruto had started his medication, the healing and regeneration that had been caused by the fox supercharging his Uzumaki traits had eliminated any of the numerous possible negative side effects. After a month, Naruto was able to be released into the care of one of the local orphanages. "Is there a pharmacy in Wave?" he asked Tazuna when his flashback had ended, praying the answer was yes because he hadn't seen one the last time around. The last time he and his students had been in Wave, he hadn't needed to visit the pharmacy because he'd gotten Naruto's prescription filled in Konoha at the last minute. This time, however. Yes, but it is controlled by Gato. The man has a stranglehold on almost every business in Wave, the hospital included. The medicine sold at the pharmacy is priced higher than almost anyone can afford," Tazuna said, scowling as his thoughts took a rather dark turn. "When I finish my bridge, Gato will no longer have a stranglehold on everything and people will finally be able to afford such basic things as food and medicine." He sighed in relief at this, and silently prayed that the pharmacy in Wave had the medication he needed, and that Naruto would be able to hold out until then. But, considering the fact that Naruto was running around in circles by the time the boat docked, he wasn't certain he would. Sakura watched in confusion as Naruto raced so far ahead of the group that she could barely see him and then ran back several times. Naruto had calmed down a bit since they'd left the academy, but, right now, he was being even more of a spaz than usual. After racing back to the group yet again, Naruto started running around them in circles instead. "Don't worry Tazuna, I'll protect you, then you can build our bridge, then everyone will be happy," Naruto chattered as he ran around Tazuna before he got distracted by something in the bushes. "There's a rabbit around Enotherius illicorabits, rabbit sericutine flufi," Naruto babbled as he raced off into said bushes, presumably in search of the rabbit. When Naruto returned from the woods carrying a frightened white rabbit, she attempted to smack him over the head for not only breaking formation but scaring the crap out of the poor woodland creature as well. Instead of allowing the blow to land, Naruto dodged her in a move that was faster than she could see, however. "Turn that poor rabbit loose, Naruto," she yelled. "Can't you see how scared it is?" "Why?" "I caught it, it is mean," Naruto yelled as Kakashi told them all to duck. A half second after she and the rest of the team except Naruto, who sprung at least 30 feet into the air still clutching the hapless rabbit, ducked, a gigantic sword went sailing over their heads or, as in Naruto's case, beneath their feet and embedded itself into a tree. When she looked up at the massive blade, there was a fearsome-looking man standing on it looking down at them, and Kakashi-sensei was standing in front of the rest of the team preparing himself for battle. "Hey Mr. Momochi, I forgot it's your rabbit, can I pit?" Naruto said, speaking faster than a 2-year-old on speed that has eaten a pound of sugar as he held up the rabbit that looked like it was about to have a heart attack. The man looked down at Naruto in confusion for a moment. The confusion rapidly turned to shock. Zabuza looked over at the group of genin led by the copy ninja Kakashi that were guarding his target. He couldn't help but do a double take at the blonde one who was holding up his decoy rabbit and asking if he could keep it. Whose bright idea had it been to dress the kid like a toddler? Taking a look at the clan marking on the boy's back that he could just barely see from his vantage point, he realized that he shouldn't have been surprised. There was a reason for the flee on-site order when it came to that particular clan. The entire Uzumaki family, as well as being incredibly skilled with seals, was both highly dangerous and batshit insane. The 7 swordsmen of the mist had learned that the hard way 50 years ago when the swords were passed down to the next generation, rather earlier than expected after one of the blonde boy's relatives had defeated all 7 of them and shoved their swords where the sun didn't shine. When he was drunk, his former master would claim that he was still finding bits of rectum on his sword. "Haku, we're getting the fuck out of here," he yelled. Had it been just that one incident, he probably would have stood and fought, but he had grown up hearing stories that he had desperately tried to forget. Ordinarily, he could handle tales of blood and gore, but blood, gore, silly string, and a prank jutsu that had deadly results for the S-class ninja that got caught in it, and the one that had pulled that off had just been a genin like the blonde brat whose parents apparently hadn't yet realized he wasn't 3 anymore. "Why?" Haku called back, hidden in some trees. "They have an Uzumaki with them, that's why," he yelled back. Haku didn't need to be told twice. Like everyone else in Water Country, he'd grown up hearing the stories. An instant after he'd answered the boy's question, he flew out of the tree in which he'd been hiding and made his break for it across the water with him trailing a few feet behind after having barely taken the time to pull his sword from the tree. That had been one hell of a close call. It seemed that nobody had seen fit to warn anyone in Kiri that the Uzumaki clan hadn't been entirely wiped out by Kumo and IWA, however unlikely as that was, now that he thought about it, as reported, since there were obviously some survivors left living in Konoha who were mixing with their population if the hyper-blonde was any indication. Though he had absolutely no loyalty to the Mizukage, he was going to rectify that situation immediately. As he raced across the water intent on putting the Uzumaki as far behind him as he could, cries of "Hey! Hey! Mr. Momochi! Can I keep the rabbit? Can I keep the rabbit?" started to come from a few feet behind him. Fearing what he would see when he looked behind him, he turned around while still running until he was running backwards. The Uzumaki boy had followed him and was still holding the little snow rabbit of Haku's that he'd used as a decoy. The rabbit was still alive, but it was now looking a little worse for wear. He would make it up to Haku later, but now. Yes. Now, go away. He yelled, hoping and praying that the boy would leave him alone as soon as he got what he wanted, and knowing he wouldn't be so lucky. Okay. Thanks, bye. The blonde Uzumaki boy yelled as he turned around and made his way back to his team, who were standing on shore staring at him in open-mouthed shock. Stunned, and almost unable to believe that his stupid plan had actually worked, he tripped and fell into the water he'd been running across. Haku ran back and hauled him back out, and a second later they were running once more. Chapter 12, Off into the Woods. Sasuke stared at the small frightened rabbit in his arms in confusion and bewilderment, as he wasn't entirely sure what he should be doing or feeling about it at the moment. A few seconds ago, Naruto had handed it to him, entrusting him with its care. After the incident with the ant farm when he was 3, nobody in his family had trusted him with anything that was still alive and quite a few things that weren't, and here Naruto was trusting him to take care of his brand new pet rabbit. He honestly didn't know whether to be honored that Naruto had actually trusted him to take care of his pet, or pissed that Naruto had dumped it on him in order to go chase a squirrel. "Here, Sasquatch rabbit." "Oh, squirrel," Naruto had said as he dumped the small white creature into his arms before he could object and raced off into the woods in a seemingly random direction. After his teammate had run off, Hatake-sensei had stared after Naruto for a couple seconds before he summoned a small pug that was dressed in blue and carrying a leash and collar in its mouth. "Find Naruto, Pakken, find Naruto," Hatake-sensei said to the blue-clad dog. Rather than follow the orders it had been given, the dog chose to stare at its surroundings instead. When the small pug's eyes landed on him, they widened in shock. The dog had then bristled and growled a bit before turning back to its master. "Kakashi, are you out of your freaking mind?" the pug named Pakken said as he whirled to face his owner. "Summoner? Just find Naruto, Pakken," Hatake-sensei said, starting to sound impatient. "But, Naruto's," Pakken whined, shaking as a look of grief crossed its doggy face. "I said, find Naruto," Hatake-sensei yelled, having finally lost his patience. Okay. I'm going, I'll find Naruto," the dog said as it started making a show of sniffing the ground, clearly humoring Hatake-sensei. As the dog drew near him, it looked like it was going to faint from shock. It sniffed around him a bit, and moved up his leg to sniff Naruto's new rabbit, which he pulled away in case the dog decided to hurt it. As it did so, the expression on its face turned to doggy disbelief. "Holy shit," the dog said. "Kakashi, you didn't. I knew you were really broken up about what happened. Don't sit there talking, find Naruto," Hatake-sensei yelled at the dog, who then shot off in the direction Naruto had run about a minute earlier as if the hounds of hell were on his heels. As soon as the dog was gone, Hatake-sensei turned to him and glared down at him. Sasuke, if anything happens to Naruto's new pet, I can assure you that you will suffer. Hatake-sensei said before he shot off after the dog. Bright. Bright. Leaf. Bright. Tree. Bright. Oh squirrel. Bright. Ebe spider. Bright. Packin. 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 Kakashi-sensei. Huh, leash? Bright. Pretty bird. Owo. Acorns. Owo. Badger. Owo. Kakashi, you do realize that raising the dead is illegal for a reason, don't you? Packin said, looking pointedly at Naruto, who was straining against his leash. Kakashi stared at the dog while yanking Naruto away from an oak tree that he had found immensely interesting for some strange reason, as Packin hadn't behaved this way the last time he'd summoned him and given him the task of finding Naruto, and he couldn't figure out why he was doing so now. He felt slightly guilty about putting Naruto on a leash, but he knew that if he didn't use it there was a good chance that Naruto would wander off somewhere if he let him go for even an instant, and he'd be nearly impossible to get back when he did. Can we talk about this later, Packin? Like when Naruto's not trying to tear my arm off so he could go look at whatever it is that's caught his interest this time? He said somewhat sarcastically. He really didn't have the time to wonder why Packin was behaving this way when he hadn't been objecting the last time he'd summoned the dog to find Naruto. Somehow, he knew that the answers to his questions would end up giving him a massive headache, which he definitely did not need on top of the one he was going to get dealing with Naruto while he was in this state. He would be talking with Packin later, however, as he was curious as to how Packin knew about Naruto's death, since he didn't remember bringing his dog summons back with him, and nobody else seemed to notice that the clock had been turned back by a good 2 years. Packin's delayed reaction to said time travel was also an item of interest. Now was not a good time to ask, though. Now was most definitely not a good time. Yanking the leash once more to keep Naruto away from a rabid-looking fox, he headed back to the road where his team was waiting for him to return with the boy. Tenzo approached Kakashi-senpai's team, wondering what he'd say to the man by way of an explanation as to why he had been following them. There was also a good chance that he wouldn't be given a chance to explain because his former captain wasn't over whatever it was that had caused him to glare at him like that when he gave Naruto the first Hokage's necklace. When he arrived at the place where the team had finally stopped for some reason, he noticed that both Naruto and Kakashi-senpai were absent. "Hello," he said, smiling and showing the pair of genin who were guarding the client the universal sign that signified that he wasn't a threat. "You wouldn't happen to know where Kakashi-senpai is, would you?" Naruto went like psycho or something, and ran off. Kakashi-sensei went after him. A very young-looking Sakura said, sounding annoyed. Crap," he groaned. His hopes that he wasn't too late had apparently been dashed despite the fact that it was a week too soon. According to the report he'd read, Naruto hadn't started using the fox's powers until a week from now, but something had obviously changed to push that timetable up a bit. Hadn't there been a skirmish with the missing nin they had battled on Tezuna's bridge today? He couldn't be too sure of that since he hadn't seen any signs of battle as he approached, and neither of the genin looked any more exhausted than their journey could explain. While he was trying to decide whether to go and search for Kakashi-senpai in order to help him bring Naruto under control or stay and hope Kakashi-senpai had things under control since Naruto couldn't even release a single tail of the fox's power yet, and he didn't know where they could be in the first place, Kakashi-senpai returned dragging Naruto on a leash. At the moment, Naruto didn't have red eyes, fangs, claws, or changed whisker markings, which indicated Kyuubi possession, so Kakashi-senpai had apparently been able to subdue the boy on his own somehow. Despite the fact that he looked completely normal, there was something off about the boy, however. Something he couldn't quite place. "What's up with him?" he asked, gesturing at Naruto, who was making a break for the nearby lake. "I forgot his meds," Kakashi-senpai said in that annoyingly casual tone of his as he yanked the boy back. "You forgot his meds?" he said, stunned. The one thing Jiraiya had made clear was that you never ever let Naruto go off his medication for any reason whatsoever. Jiraiya had made the mistake once and had to pay out about 1 million in damages to the inn they had been staying at the time, and about another 1 million to the town because of the destruction Naruto had caused when he'd gotten loose. On his medication, Naruto was merely hyper, rather inattentive, and somewhat impulsive. Off it, Naruto was a whirlwind of unfocused chaos and destruction that moved faster than humanly possible and literally bounced off the walls. Because of this, he had always made sure to bring at least 3 backup bottles of Naruto's medication on missions in case one or more were destroyed in a fight. "You forgot his meds?" he repeated, unable to process the act of stupidity that Kakashi-senpai had committed. The first Hokage's necklace wouldn't be able to fix this. The only thing that could be done was to get to the nearest pharmacy ASAP. But the nearest pharmacy was most likely at least several miles away, however, and the leash Kakashi had Naruto on looked rather flimsy. If Naruto got loose, there was no telling when they would get him back or how much chaos and destruction he would cause in the meantime. Jiraiya had been forced to chase the boy for 3 days straight, and had only caught him because he'd lucked out and ran into Naruto during one of his infrequent 1-minute naps. Jiraiya was Kage level easy, and he and Kakashi-senpai couldn't say the same about themselves. Kakashi had only caught Naruto this time because he was still a little slow. Who knew how hard it would be to catch the boy in a few hours? "Yes, I believe that we've already established that," Kakashi-senpai said tersely as he pulled Naruto away from a bush. As Naruto did his utmost to escape, Uchiha Sasuke and Haruno Sakura stared at them open-mouthed during the conversation. The Uchiha boy was holding on to a white rabbit for some strange reason, and didn't seem to notice that it was eating his shirt. The old man that they were guarding didn't really look nearly as surprised as Naruto's teammates, however. In fact, he looked torn between amused and wanting to be as far away from here as he could be. "Why were you following us?" Kakashi asked Tenzo as the group got back on the road again. "No particular reason. I still had a few weeks of vacation left, and decided that I wouldn't mind seeing wherever it is you were going," Tenzo replied, trying to sound casual. "And, this isn't in any way related to that necklace you gave Naruto?" he asked, glaring at his former subordinate, who started slightly at this but otherwise remained impassive. "Were you hoping that whatever curse was supposedly on it would cause him to drop dead, and that you'd be there to see it?" he asked when he didn't get an immediate reply. "Curse? Oh, you mean that thing with the Tsunade's younger brother and fiancé? I'd completely forgotten about that. I only gave it to him because the first Hokage did something to it which will enable me to deal with Naruto's furry little problem if it ever gets out of hand," Tenzo said, sounding slightly embarrassed. "Furry little problem?" he asked, slightly amused at how his former subordinate had gotten around breaking the Hokage's law. Moments before, he'd been prepared to kill Tenzo, who'd been something approaching a friend to him during his days in ANBU, for giving Naruto that accursed necklace, and he probably would have already gone after the man if he didn't have to hold Naruto's leash, since, if he handed the boy over to one of the others, he'd be long gone before you could say "get back here." If there was another reason for giving Naruto that necklace that he'd been unable to get off of the boy so far because the child had been carefully guarding it every time he tried, he'd be willing to hear it, and, if it was good enough, he might consider sparing Tenzo. "I'll explain it better when we're away from prying ears and overly inquiring minds," Tenzo said, gesturing to the pair of Genin and Tazuna, who quickly tried to look innocent. Naruto, however, was completely oblivious to the situation and was scratching his head with his foot like a dog. "Fine, whatever. We've got to get to the pharmacy before it closes," he said to Tenzo, making it clear that he would be dealing with the man later. Chapter 13, Getting Naruto's Meds. The instant they reached Wave's main trading port, Kakashi raced into the pharmacy, not caring at that moment that it was owned and quite likely operated by the enemy. Sometimes, there were dangers that were far worse than a merely potential enemy, and this situation was one of them. As he ran to the counter at the back, He held Naruto's leash in his left hand and the empty pill bottle in his right. "Here's the prescription, I don't care how much it costs. Refill it, and refill it quick," he yelled, slamming the bottle and a piece of paper he'd pulled from his vest down on the counter in front of the startled pharmacist as he yanked on the leash to keep Naruto from causing chaos and destruction in the small pharmacy. The pharmacist looked at the prescription and frowned. "You do realize that this was issued in Fire Country?" the pharmacist said. "What does that have to do with anything?" he yelled. "We don't fill foreign prescriptions here. You'll have to get one from one of our doctors," the pharmacist said smugly. "Well, hurry up and get the doctor," he snapped. After a wait of about an hour, during which Naruto destroyed the contents of the shelves nearest to him, which fortunately weren't necessities unless one didn't know which seals, jutsu, or even common plants aided in either contraception or pregnancy detection, and nearly snapped the leash twice, the pharmacist's assistant arrived with the doctor. "What seems to be the problem?" the doctor said in that tone of voice that pretty much meant, "I'm bored and I'm slightly hungry, so I'm going to rush you out of my office without even looking at you so I can take an early lunch. Can you just copy this down and hand it to the pharmacist so I can get it filled?" he asked as he shoved the prescription in the doctor's face. The doctor took the prescription and barely glanced at it. He looked like he was going to say something for a second afterward, but he paused and looked at the prescription again instead. His eyes widened and his jaw dropped as he did so. "What's his diagnosis?" the doctor asked, looking at his patient for the first time. "Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder," he replied. "Where is he on the Yamanaka scale?" the doctor asked, sounding as if he were trying to stay calm and barely managing it. "The scale doesn't go that high, but when he was 2, Yamanaka and Noichi estimated him to be at about a 75 using the scale's criteria," he said as he yanked Naruto away from the last of the pregnancy tests. "S70F5? the doctor stammered, staring at Naruto with a look of horror and amazement. Scoring a 75 on a scale that only went to 50 was quite the achievement, and in this case it was not a good thing. "Is his disorder hereditary, or?" the doctor asked before trailing off as a horrifying thought suddenly occurred to him. "It is believed to be chakra-induced, though there is a possible hereditary element from his mother's side," he replied. He knew this because he'd forced himself to read all of the boring reports when he had first taken his team the first time around. Of course, Naruto's mother's attention problems could have also been caused by the Kyuubi, but there were some indications that they had already been present and had merely been exacerbated by the biju that she'd contained. When the doctor had finally processed his reply to his question, he looked like he was about to faint. He somehow managed not to do so, however, and after gathering his wits, he turned towards the pharmacy counter. Moving incredibly quickly for a civilian, he dove over said pharmacy counter and started searching for something. When he found what was presumably the correct container, he opened it and hurriedly checked its contents against a nearby reference book. When he was satisfied with the results, he turned and raced back with the large jar that supposedly held the pharmacy's entire supply of the medication Naruto took. Despite what it says on the outside of the container, this is the medication that was prescribed. Pills in the extremely high dosage his prescription requires, however, have to be custom-made. I'm sure you can figure out how many of these you'll need to give him to reach the proper dosage on your own. You can have these free of charge," the still extremely pale doctor said as he shoved the container at him and hopped back over the counter. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll be moving out of the country," the doctor said as he broke into a sprint and raced out of the door. After getting a better grip on the container that had been given to him, he stayed where he was instead of following the man, knowing that the pharmacist would be requesting payment for the damage Naruto had caused at the very least. If it turned out that what he had been handed could be considered poison due to the fact that it was meant to treat something else entirely, the doctor could be dealt with later. While the Kyuubi could and would deal with any poison Naruto ingests, is injected with, or absorbs via osmosis, some poisons made him ill. And, if what he'd been handed could be considered poison, He would kill the doctor mostly out of principle, and partially because he'd most likely be stuck with a super hyper brat with a tummy ache. The contents of the jar had better be as stated for both the doctor's sake and the sake of his own sanity. It had been after this mission that he'd learned about Naruto's virtual immunity to poison the last time around. During Naruto's first hospital trip as his student the last time around, he had discovered the hospital's poisons that Uzumaki Naruto has ingested list in the doctor's break room. Ethylene glycol had topped the exceedingly long list with 5 tick marks and about a dozen question marks. If he'd known about the list before the mission to Wave the first time, he wouldn't have unnecessarily worried his student about the poison that the Demon Brothers' weapons had introduced into his bloodstream, and caused him to slice his hand open. While the wound had promptly healed, Naruto had gone through a great deal of unnecessary pain and distress. The surprising fact to those who knew about the Kyuubi was that almost all of Naruto's poisonings, which nobody had seen fit to inform him about previously, had been accidents. By the time he had turned 3, the workers at the orphanage had brought him in almost daily to have his stomach pumped. Apparently, after he'd gotten out of the hospital when he was 2, the kid had picked up a habit of vanishing if you turned around for more than 1 second, and also picked up an even more distressing habit of drinking out of any container that contained liquid or trying to eat out of any container that contained solids that he got his little hands on. Child-proof lids had proven not to be, even the ones with special safety seals on them. Had his sensei survived to raise Naruto, the boy would have driven him absolutely nuts. What was that all about? The pharmacist's assistant asked, finally recovering from the shock of seeing the local doctor behaving so oddly. The pharmacist, who seemed curious himself, picked up the bottle he had set on the counter and read the label as he went into the back. Then, he walked over to what was presumably his desk, grabbed a battered copy of the psychiatrist's desk reference Suna edition that was set amongst several reference books that were peripherally related to his work, and started leafing through it. After finding the correct entry and reading for about a minute, he turned very pale. He looked at Naruto's pill bottle again and went even paler before he started shaking. Go. The medication is free. Don't worry about the damage either. Just go. The rather frightened-looking pharmacist said. Not bothering to look a gift horse in the mouth, seeing as said gift horse couldn't exactly hurt and may actually improve the situation in question, he turned and left, dragging Naruto behind him, grabbing a large amount of candy on his way out, knowing that, if Naruto was anything like he had been when he was 2 in his current condition, getting him to swallow the pills without it would be nearly impossible, and that it was probably going to take about a week to get Naruto back to normal. When the pharmacist didn't comment, he crammed the candy into his pockets and headed out the door with the jar of medication in one hand and Naruto's leash in the other. Why'd you do that? The pharmacist's assistant asked as the ninja and the rather destructive kid he'd been dragging around on a leash vanished out the door. He knew for a fact that his boss loved only 2 things, his work and money, not necessarily in that order. The reason he stayed with the man, other than the fact that he only took a rather small percentage of the income from his illegal drug sales, was that, unlike most of the more unscrupulous pharmacists he had worked for in the past who had loved money more than their work, his boss refused to water down and or adulterate the medications he sold. Instead, his boss gave out cheaper medications and older remedies that worked the same as their newer and more expensive counterparts and pocketed the difference. To let a great deal of potential money leave as well as absorbing the cost of damage someone else had caused was completely out of character for the man. The doctor's reaction to the boy on the leash was extremely unsettling as well. Let's just say that I think going on an extended visit to your cousins in water would be a very good idea right about now, his boss said. But I hate my cousins, and the feeling is mutual on their end as well, he said. His cousins had hated him for sullying the family name by dealing drugs, and he had hated his cousins for being a bunch of arrogant bastards who thought they were better than everyone because they were ninja. At least you'll be safe there, his boss said. They said that they would disembowel me if they saw me again, he replied, shuddering as he remembered how his cousin Shinji had been wielding a large steak knife as he chased him off the property during a family gathering. His boss picked up the bottle that the one-eyed ninja had left behind and pointed to a spot on the label. Notice anything significant about the birth date? His boss asked. He read the date. What was so important about October 10th? He looked over at the name of the person for whom the prescription had been made. His blood ran cold. All throughout his childhood his mother had told him that if he wasn't a good boy, an Uzumaki would get him. He'd never believed her, and had instead believed it when his friends had told him that the Uzumaki were all dead. His mother had been right all along. He hadn't been a good boy, and if that Uzumaki hadn't been kept on a leash he would have gotten him. No, but look at the name. He replied once he was sure he could speak. Uzumaki Naruto, what about it? His boss asked. You'll find out when we get to water, he said. His cousin's place was suddenly looking a lot more welcoming by the moment. Tenzo wasn't sure if everything went well at the pharmacy or not, considering the look on Kakashi-senpai's face as he was coming up the road to the house. He had been waiting by the window of the bridge builder Tezuna's home since he, the remaining genin of Team 7, and the old man had arrived. Sasuke was over in the corner tending to the small snowshoe hare that was in a box that had been provided by Tezuna's daughter Tsunami, and Sakura was seated next to Sasuke pretending to be interested in the rabbit while she practically molested the boy. As things appeared to be settled here, he went to meet Kakashi-senpai at the door. Here. If you let go of this leash for even a second, I will kill you, Kakashi-senpai said by way of greeting as he handed him Naruto's leash. Uchiha, Sakura, make yourselves useful and break these into smaller pieces. I'm going to need about a dozen of them, Kakashi-senpai said as he tossed a pair of candy bars at the genin before he opened a large jar that was presumably full of pills. Kakashi then pulled several medium-sized green tablets from the jar he'd been carrying with him, muttering as he added something up. After setting the pills and broken pieces of candy bar in a relatively open space within easy reach, Kakashi-senpai signaled for him to bring Naruto over. After an extremely short chase thanks to the leash, Kakashi-senpai managed to grab the boy. He then shoved the first pill into his mouth and made him swallow it. A piece of chocolate followed an instant later. He repeated this procedure another dozen times. As soon as he was done, Kakashi-senpai cast a jutsu on the boy that put him to sleep and waited for about a minute. Once the minute was over, he began to relax. The fact that he's sleeping rather than throwing it off and racing around is probably a good sign. I'm going to go put him to bed, and I'll be talking with you later, when there won't be anyone trying to listen in, Kakashi-senpai said as he picked Naruto up and carried him upstairs. Tsunami, who had sat quietly and watched the spectacle alongside Tezuna, a small boy who hid behind a piece of furniture, and Naruto's teammates, was looking almost longingly at the jar of pills that had been left behind. What? He asked. My friend Usagi has been saving up for months to get her son's prescription filled. Do you think you can spare a few? Tsunami replied. I'm not sure. Based on how much Kakashi gave Naruto, there doesn't seem to be enough to last for the rest of the mission, he said after he looked into the jar and calculated its contents. He knew that Naruto would be here for a few weeks and, if he got Kakashi to very carefully ration the pills and not use nearly as many as he did today, they just might last that long if they were extremely lucky. Why don't you send a messenger back to Konoha and get more? Sakura asked. Why didn't I think of that earlier? He said, feeling like an idiot. While a person would normally have to worry about their messenger being intercepted, he usually didn't, as none of his summons had been caught by human hands so far. After quickly grabbing a piece of paper and a writing implement, he scrawled out a short note. What does code orange 3-2, Kakashi found temporary solution but running low mean? Sakura asked, obviously having read over his shoulder. Code orange is when Naruto pulls a prank, Sasuke said. How do you know that? Sakura asked. My dad and it. Him both got called out after that paint bomb incident 5 years ago, Sasuke said. Actually, Code Orange is a reference to Naruto himself, and you don't need to worry about the rest," he said before he started the seals for the summoning jutsu. "Rocky, take this to the captain, and hurry back with whatever he gives you," he said as he handed the note to his favorite summon, who then hopped out the window and scurried away. "Why didn't you poison the ninja when you had the chance?" Gato asked the doctor that had treated the ninja who had been hired to protect the thrice-damned bridge builder Tazuna. "Do you have any idea what those idiots brought here?" The doctor cried hysterically as he frantically packed, haphazardly throwing everything he could reach into any container he could find. "What did they bring?" he asked, wondering if he should worry, considering the doctor's actions. "There is only a maximum of 8 recorded cases of chakra-induced attention deficit hyperactivity disorder at any given time. The one thing those 8 cases have in common is that the person suffering from the disorder is a Jinchuriki," the doctor said as he grabbed his surgical instruments and crammed them into a woman's handbag. "That doesn't answer my question about why you didn't poison him," he said, covering his ignorance about the meaning of the term Jinchuriki. The doctor had been a civilian employee at a shinobi hospital in Kumo before he was fired for sexual misconduct. And, whatever the hell a Jinchuriki was, it was obviously some ninja thing. "He's a Jinchuriki. The deadliest poison in the elemental countries would only give him a mild case of indigestion. I should know, considering that I was on the team that got called in when someone tried to assassinate the Raikage's younger brother," the doctor said as he crammed a bunch of files into a trash can that he then set next to a rice bag full of clothes. "At the very least, you shouldn't have treated him," he said, figuring that Jinchuriki was a term for one of those bloodline traits that the ninja spoke of, probably a rather formidable one if the doctor's fear was any indication. "You should be glad that I did. I just headed off an incalculable amount of chaos and destruction by doing so. I'm thanking my lucky stars that that crooked pharmacist of yours had the old treatment for ADHD, which was derived from medication that was created for Suna's first Jinchuriki on hand, rather than what's been the standard treatment in the decade, since they noticed the stuff caused a mild, and in rare cases, moderate to severe drain on a person's chakra reserves. Even with the medication, that kid has enough power to blow half the continent off the map, and when he's completely off his medication, a brain-damaged gnat would be extremely focused in comparison to him. When those two things are put together, it's very bad for everyone around him, which unfortunately would currently include you and your business," the doctor said as he scribbled something on a prescription pad. "Here's my letter of resignation. I'm going to be moving away, far away. I don't want to be in the same country, or much less on the same continent, with a Jinchuriki that's been hired to oppose you and your employees," the doctor said, tearing off a sheet of paper and handing it to him. While he stared dumbfoundedly at the note, the doctor took his chance to make good on his escape. "If there's anything left standing on the island by the time I reach my destination, I'll send someone to pick up the rest of my stuff," the doctor called over his shoulder before grabbing the sack that contained his clothes and the handbag that contained his equipment and racing off to the wharf to catch the next boat out of wave. Kakashi sighed as he summoned Pakken and Bull before he went to bed. After the rather eventful afternoon, things had finally calmed down a bit. He was extremely tired, and hadn't found a good time to have the conversation with Tenzo, which could be put on hold until tomorrow. Tenzo, a man who, before today, he could almost consider a friend, was the reason he had summoned Bull. If the man made any aggressive moves towards Naruto, he would get a rather nasty surprise. Bull was fast despite his massive size and would be able to slow Tenzo down enough for him to reach the boy's room and respond to the situation, if Bull didn't kill the man first, that is. After Bull was dispatched to Naruto's bedside, he turned to Pakken. "Explain," he said. "Explain what?" Pakken asked. "When I summoned you to find Naruto, you questioned my sanity. During the search you accused me of raising him from the dead," he replied. "Explain now." Pakken stared at him with a look of total confusion in his eyes. "I never said anything about Naruto being dead," the dog said. "Yes, you did," he replied. "So, That's where the other Pakken went earlier. Pakken said as understanding appeared to dawn on him. Other Pakken? He asked. Time travel doesn't work in our realm the way it does in yours. Unlike here where you can't exist in two places at once and merge with your past self, we can and do remain separate. I wouldn't recommend trying to summon us both at the same time because, when we're both in this plane we would be forced to merge and the result wouldn't be pretty. If it doesn't kill us outright, that is. By the way, around the same time your pack from the future arrived, the toads and the flying squirrels started going nuts about something and closed their borders. Pakken replied. The toads I get, considering the fact that Jiraiya showed up several months earlier than he had the last time around and, now that I think of it, the way he acted around Naruto when I introduced them was as if he'd been pretending that he doesn't know the boy. I had ignored the man's odd behavior because I knew he hadn't meant Naruto any harm. But, the flying squirrels? He thought. Flying squirrels? He asked, knowing that Pakken would understand his meaning and give a report. What? I thought they were cute. Tenzo said, having entered the room just as he asked Pakken his question. Chapter 14, Contracts and Naruto's Little Habit. Naruto awoke feeling relatively normal after having had an odd dream where he'd been the Kyuubi, and he had been locked in a padded room and was dying of boredom. Figuring that it might have had something to do with when he appeared in front of the Fox's prison sometime during the night, he put it out of mind and did his best to forget it. He'd mostly tuned the Fox out during his unwanted visit to the creature, but, now that he thought about it, he could vaguely remember the Kyuubi saying something about a padded room. Feeling rather more energetic than he usually did in the morning, he hopped up off the futon someone had put him on and raced downstairs. Morning, Kakashi-sensei. He chirped happily as he entered the kitchen where Tsunami was preparing breakfast. You seem surprisingly normal, Kakashi said as he poured himself a cup of coffee. I thought it would take a week or more for that to happen, but, then again, I'm not a medical professional and you're definitely not normal. Not all of the meds were out of my system yet when I reached what someone once called my squirrel on speed stage, and the mangy furball has had a decade of practice at maintaining the proper levels of medication in my system. It said something about some padded room being boring when it fixed everything last night. He replied, ignoring the strange stare Sakura, who had just made her way into the room, was giving him. I knew there was something wrong with you, Naruto. Sakura finally yelled at him. There has to be something seriously wrong with a person who would invent a perverted sex-change jutsu. That last bit was off the wall, but it looked like she'd decided to use yesterday as an opportunity to harp on the Oiroke jutsu yet again. Sakura had yelled at him about the jutsu after his in-class demonstration during the transformation test, and she'd yelled at him about it again after she'd learned that that was how he and Sasuke had gotten into a bar, accusing him of attempting to corrupt her precious Sasuke. The last time around, she yelled at him and hit him because he had taught it to Konohamaru, and would hit him for every time he or Konohamaru used it in front of her. Now, she was deciding to bring it up again for whatever reason. I didn't invent it, he said. I found it on an old scroll that the old man Hokage gave me for my birthday. I did make several modifications to it, including the harem jutsu though. What? Everyone at the table waiting for their meal who knew about the sexy jutsu, which was everyone but Tazuna and family, said at once. Who invented it then? Sakura asked, probably trying to catch him in a lie so she would have a legitimate excuse to hit him. Senju Tobirama. He invented it so he could get into the women's side of the onsen he visited unnoticed. According to what I've found out about him, he was something like Ero Sennin, except he didn't have to pay to get laid, and wasn't rendered incapable of reproduction by a teammate that caught him spying on her during an intimate moment with her fiancé. He replied. Kakashi spat out the coffee that he'd been drinking through his mask, something Naruto found somewhat disgusting considering the various things up to, and including the blood of other ninja that could get on the mask before the coffee even touched it, and turned to look at him. Sasuke looked down at his shorts and winced, probably imagining the myriad of painful ways in which a man could be rendered sterile by an angry kunoichi. Sakura, however. Naruto. Don't tell lies about the second Hokage. Sakura yelled as she punched him in the head. He'd learned not to dodge too much because, if he did, it would be much worse for him the next time she managed to get him. I'm not lying. Let's just say that if someone wanted to take out Hashirama Senju's line, they'd just have to kill Tsunade, but if they wanted to take out Tobirama's, they'd have to wipe out a small to sizable chunk of Suna, Kumo, Hiri, and Iwa before going off and hunting up and down the entire damn continent. Oh, and they'd have to take me out too, he said. Why no one else in Konoha? Kakashi asked, apparently checking to see if he knew anything about the not-so-well-hidden Hitaki family secret. The first Hokage made a nod in Konoha, unless you plan to marry her rule, which he signed into law the instant he was in office to prevent certain problems with the other clans. Since Tobirama couldn't get married without like 1,000 women going after his blood for doing so, and he wanted to survive with his balls intact, he pretty much kept to the rule. There were rumors of him having tried to skirt around the law by having relations with a woman who was already married, but they were declared to have been malicious after the parents of the infant in question revealed that being born with gray hair was something that popped up on the father's side of the family once every couple of generations or so, and that a few of the mother's more distant relatives had been born with gray hair as well. After Tobirama made Hokage, he toned it down a bit when he was away because he didn't want another incident like the one where Yuzu nearly declared war on Konoha despite the fact that they were eternal allies. He replied, "Let me guess, you're going to say that the second Hokage bedded the Whirlpool Daimyo's daughter and you're a descendant?" Sakura said sarcastically, clearly not believing what he was saying. It looked like Sasuke and Yamato Taicho doubted him as well. He knew that Kakashi knew the story was true. Why wouldn't he, since the last 2 generations of the Hitaki were actually Senju? Tazuna looked like he was trying not to laugh or something, and Tsunami was looking scandalized by the whole conversation, but wasn't sure if it was safe to interrupt a ninja. Inari was looking depressed as always. Close. His niece. Her daughter married into the Uzumaki clan and had Kushina who had me. He replied. Yeah, right. Sasuke said. If I may ask, what's so funny? Yamato Taicho said, turning to Tazuna who was still trying not to laugh. Compared to the rest of his clan, your first Hokage was a prude. Your second was rather normal for a Senju. Tazuna said before he finally started laughing. You're not my great-uncle, are you? He asked after thinking over what the old bridge builder had said. Considering the fact that Tobirama had really gotten around, and had cashed in on his status as the brother of the best head the Senju clan had seen in centuries any number of times, it was within the realm of possibility that he was related to the old drunk. Nah, I'm not that closely related to you. A couple centuries ago, Wave was a dumping ground for thieves and whores from fire, whirlpool, and water, and was still a little wild 100 years ago when the Senju showed up to deal with a pirate problem at the behest of the local daimyo. I'm reasonably certain they had one hell of a time while they were here, since the dominant hair color for the region went from brown to black within 2 generations. Tazuna said. It was at this point that Tsunami set breakfast down at the table, putting the plates down in front of their recipients a little more firmly than was necessary. Apparently, she didn't find this to be appropriate conversation for the breakfast table, especially in front of a child. After breakfast, Kakashi, upon realizing that he was back to normal and wasn't going to suddenly run off into the woods or something, gave him and the rest of the team permission to explore. He instantly knew where he was going. He was going to get his favorite drink, one he only rarely got because people kept chasing him away from it. He never knew why everyone kept saying it was poison when they did so. Poison tasted nasty, and this stuff was sweet, so there was no way that it could possibly be poison. You guys go on ahead, I'm going to go get something to drink, he said when he reached the place where the sweet goodness was kept. You're getting something to drink in a shed? Sakura asked, looking confused. Sasuke just smirked and followed him inside as he went to get his precious. There was only one bottle here towards the back, hidden amongst some cleaning supplies and spare parts for a boat motor, and it was only 3/4 of the way full, but he knew where there were others. Grabbing it with a cry of joy, he briefly hugged it to himself before he opened it and started chugging. Remembering his manners, he stopped and offered the bottle to Sasuke. Sasuke took a swig from the bottle. His eyes then widened in shock at the flavor, before he spat it out. He should have remembered that Sasuke hated sweets. Sasuke turned the bottle in his hands around and looked at the label on the back and gaped at it for a moment before getting up and running. "Sakura, go get Hatake-sensei," Sasuke yelled. "Naruto just attempted suicide and tried taking me with him. Hurry. I'll keep an eye on him until you get back." He wondered what the hell that was all about. He hadn't tried to commit suicide, and if he ever did make an attempt, he wouldn't try to take anyone other than Madara and that mangy fox with him. What was that all about? He asked Sasuke when he returned. Sasuke didn't reply, he just sat there staring at him, looking as if he'd seen a ghost or something. After about a minute, he realized that Sasuke was probably going to stay like that and decided to ignore him and finish off what little was left in the bottle that Sasuke had spilled when he had dropped it on his way out, savoring it because he didn't know when he would have another chance to get at all of the other bottles in the village thanks to Sasuke's little suicide alert that would most likely cause Kakashi and Yamato Taicho to watch him much more closely. He remembered what happened the last time they had thought he was suicidal. At least Iruka wouldn't be there, not letting him out of his sight for even a second, going as far as trying to follow him into the bathroom, frantically knocking if he thought he was too silent or taking too long, and looking relieved every time he came out. About 2 minutes after Sasuke's bizarre outburst, Kakashi and Yamato came bursting in. Kakashi enveloped him in a hug as he snatched the bottle out of his hands and threw it to the floor. "Naruto, whatever's wrong, it'll be okay," he said, clutching him tighter. "I'll..." Whatever he was going to say next was cut off by Yamato Taicho. "Senpai," Yamato Taicho said. "What?" Kakashi snapped. "You know, the only time I ever saw Sai show any genuine emotion before Naruto managed to get him to crack during our first mission together was when he caught sight of Naruto's dessert back at the inn. If Jiraiya hadn't told me about his little habit, I would have panicked myself," Yamato Taicho said as he held the bottle up so the label of its contents was prominently displayed. Kakashi's almost desperate grip on him loosened a bit, and he sighed. "Naruto," Kakashi said. "Yes, Kakashi-sensei?" he asked. "How many times have you been told not to drink antifreeze?" Kakashi asked. Sasuke and Sakura, who was out of breath from running so quickly, stood there staring in shock. "Lots," he replied. He knew the but Erosenin lets me do it. Excuse wouldn't fly at the moment, so he bit it back. "I'm going to have to come up with a suitable punishment for you later. Right now, however, you're going to have to apologize to your teammates for scaring them," Kakashi said as he let him go. "On a side note, you two, I wouldn't recommend using Naruto as a taste tester to see if your food is safe or not. He's immune to just about every poison known to mankind. With him, sometimes a stomach ache is just a stomach ache, and other times, it's something else like ricin or strychnine," Kakashi said, turning to Sasuke and Sakura. "That's one of the reasons we have such a hard time keeping him away from antifreeze. The only reason we do so really is because he doesn't seem to think it's dangerous and might offer it to someone who didn't know what it was, like his little friend Konohamaru." Kakashi continued, turning back towards him, obviously trying to press some point. "It's a miracle he hasn't done so already, considering the number of other people he's offered it to." The look on Sai's face was absolutely priceless. Yamato Taicho said. That was the second time that the man had brought up Sai, and the incident back when he'd first met him and Yamato Taicho, which was odd because that didn't happen for another 3 years. Either that, or there was some mission that he was forgetting for some reason that might have had to do with Danzo. He wouldn't put it past the old man to have sent him on missions back when he was at the academy and wiped them from his memory. Actually, I think the Hokage might have told Konohamaru not to drink anything that Naruto offered him for that reason. Kakashi said. That, and the fact that he accidentally poisoned the council when he was 6. Or rather Homura did when he stole Naruto's thermos when he passed him while he was on his way to the academy. It's a pity that Danzo didn't like kiddie drinks. Throughout the rest of the exchange between Kakashi-sensei and Yamato Ticho, Sasuke and Sakura stared at him in horrified shock. After a rather nice lunch during which Kakashi-senpai scolded Naruto for worrying his teammates over something they probably hadn't noticed the last time around and wouldn't have noticed this time if he hadn't behaved so oddly yesterday, he sent the genin out to train. Minutes after the students left, there was a knock at the door. Tsunami answered it, paling at the sight of whoever was on the other side. He immediately went to high alert at this, as did Kakashi-senpai, only relaxing when Tsunami moved to the side to reveal his captain, Jiraiya, and what looked to be several heavily armed hunter nin. Report. His captain said, barking at Kakashi-senpai rather than him. Kakashi-senpai looked rather puzzled by this, but it was understandable considering the fact that he had forgotten to tell the man that he had sent away for more medication during their conversation last night. Hatake Kakashi allowed Uzumaki Naruto's medication to run out and neglected to get a refill before leaving Konoha. As a result, Uzumaki went without his medication for a couple days, and there was a minor incident. He said to prevent potential embarrassment for his senpai. Minor incident? His captain asked. Uzumaki ran off into the woods after a squirrel, but Jounin Hatake was able to retrieve him after several minutes with the aid of a tracking summon. He replied. The team of hunter nin who looked to be preparing for the Itachi maneuver turned towards Kakashi-senpai. Their body language spoke of reverent awe. It had been after Jiraiya had spoken of his experiences with Naruto off his meds in the timeline he had come from that he had finally learned why they would react to Naruto's capture in such a manner and read the report of the mission that had spawned the highly unusual technique that was labeled as the Itachi maneuver, and was listed as the standard capture procedure for one Uzumaki Naruto in the event of a Section 3 situation. When Naruto had first entered the academy, the school medic who had some ideas about the medicating of children was in charge of giving Naruto his medication. She didn't. Naruto had run off into the woods after some small furry animal and, for over a month, all efforts to capture him, including those made by the most experienced hunter nin, had failed. It was entirely possible that he would never have been captured if Uchiha Itachi hadn't come up with the bright, or rather so insanely stupid and incredibly off-the-wall it actually worked idea of soaking his clothing and armor in instant ramen. Itachi returned half a day later carrying a surprisingly calm Naruto who kept trying to eat his shirt when he wasn't gnawing on his chest plate. We were able to reach town where Hatake found a local pharmacy that carried Uzumaki's medication, but at much smaller doses. Upon realizing that there wasn't enough medication to last until the end of the mission, which won't be completed for at least another 3 weeks, I followed Genin Haruno Sakura's suggestion to send for more. He said, concluding his summary of events. What is Uzumaki's condition? His captain asked, looking as if he was dreading the answer. His behavior seems to have returned to normal. He even downed a whole bottle of antifreeze this morning. He replied, relieved that the situation hadn't been worse. Rather than looking relieved at this, his captain stiffened at his statement, and several of the hunter nin started reaching into their packs for their med kits, preparing for a medical emergency. I can't believe I vouched for you, his captain said, shaking his head sadly as the hunter nin left the room, presumably in search of a Naruto they believed to be in need of serious medical attention. Apparently, someone had failed to pass on the memo, and it was only Naruto's immediate caretakers that knew of his little habit, as they tended to discover it the hard way. His captain would be calming down as soon as he saw that Naruto was fine and not in need of any help. The fact that his captain had had to vouch for him, however, sounded ominous. Vouched for me? He asked. The Hokage put out an order for you to be captured and detained. The only reason there aren't hunter nins on your ass right now is because I told him that you weren't in your right mind at the time, that the statements you had made in my presence indicated that you hadn't meant Uzumaki any harm, that you would return on your own soon, and that you would come in quietly when you did. His captain said, looking at him in disgust. I told you. I warned you and everyone else under my command. No matter what your personal feelings for Uzumaki are, he's the Hokage's pet, and, his captain continued before Jiraiya cut him off. Actually, he's on the list of potential successors, and, if he isn't ready by the time Hiruzen-sensei dies, he's on the successor list of one, possibly even two or more of the candidates for Godame. He's also on Hyuga Hayashi's rather short list of boys not to murder if my daughter brings them home. Jiraiya said, sounding more proud of the fact that Naruto had somehow managed to impress the Hyuga clan leader than the fact that Naruto could potentially become the Godame or the Rokudaime Hokage. How Naruto had ended up on Hyuga Hayashi's list already was a mystery he'd love to solve, considering the fact that the boy had not yet pulled the stick out of Hyuga Niji's ass or given Hyuga Hinata her confidence boost. Whatever the boy had done had to have been something, considering the fact he'd heard that the head of the Hyuga clan had given the shovel speech to the heir of one of Konoha's more important clans when the boy had made the mistake of smiling at his daughter in his presence. If the situation wasn't so serious, he would have laughed at the expression that crossed his captain's face at Jiraiya's comment. Zabuza felt like crying as he read the fine print of the contract Gato had shoved under his nose after he'd learned that he'd fled the scene of battle, sparing the bridge builder Tazuna in the process. If he broke the deal, he would be in the poorhouse, forced to pay the bastard Gato for the privilege of working for him. If he killed Gato right now, as he was tempted to do, he'd be swimming in an ocean of debt that would have every damn debt collector on the continent out for his blood, which would make him have to really run because they wouldn't be searching for him as half-assedly as the hunter Nin from back home were. He had no choice. He would have to go back and pray that the Uzumaki was off doing whatever it was they did when they weren't totally destroying their opponents in the most humiliating ways possible. He'd only escaped with his life this time because the child had been more interested in Haku's rabbit than fighting, and there was very little chance that he would be so fortunate the next time. And why did you run from the battle with your tail between your legs even before the fighting started? Gato asked when he'd noticed that he'd finally slogged through all of the tedious fine print that you'd nearly need a microscope to see. He'd tried to read it all before but had given up after the first migraine the last time. This time, however, he'd managed to push through the pain because he knew he had to. The Gato bastard had his balls in a vice and he knew it, and now, he knew it. They had an Uzumaki with them. He replied as if that explained everything because, well, it did. What is an Uzumaki? Gato asked, apparently unaware of the existence of the most fearsome ninja clan in history. If I'm considered to be a devil, the Uzumaki would be considered to be some sort of hell god on a level I could never reach. At least I would let a person die with a modicum of dignity. The Uzumaki never give you that chance. He answered, whimpering at the thought of being forced to go up against such a creature. It was his fault for taking the job, however. Chapter 15, Discussions of the Future. Naruto watched as Yamato Taicho left with the ANBU captain and the hunter Nin half an hour after sunup. The mission, namely protect Tazuna until he finishes his bridge, had been allowed to continue once his meds and enough spare bottles to stock a pharmacy had been handed to Kakashi. Jiraiya had wanted to stay but had gone with the ANBU party after he requested that he make sure nothing bad happened to Yamato Taicho. Yamato may have had the creepiest stare besides that of Orochimaru, but he was a good man and had kept the Kyuubi from popping out at inopportune times during his training, completely exhausting himself in the process. Having the Sandaime angry at him wasn't something the poor man deserved, especially because it wasn't good for his health and possibly his continued existence depending on how pissed the old man was. His punishment for scaring the rest of his team over the antifreeze incident turned out to be that he had to listen to a long lecture about ethylene glycol, its intended uses, none of which were human consumption - its effects on the normal human body, and why one shouldn't try and get their friends to drink it immediately after breakfast. On the punishment scale, it was just below getting his stomach pumped again. It had been after Kakashi-sensei had set them to reviewing the tree-climbing exercise and seemingly ditched them, when in reality he was sticking to Tazuna and family like glue in case Zabuza showed up again, as the genin were perfectly safe with Naruto nearby, that he found his opportunity to talk to Sasuke about the future and why seeking vengeance is bad for one's health, amongst other things. "Hey, Sasuke. Would you mind coming here a bit? I have something to tell you," he said. Sasuke looked at him warily, but dropped off the tree trunk and followed him deeper into the woods. Once they found an acceptable clearing, he sat down and indicated for Sasuke to do the same. "Well, to start off with, the reason I couldn't tell you these things back in Konoha is because the walls have ears, and I didn't want to deal with interference from Shimura. I do incredibly evil things for the good of the village Danzo who wouldn't want you to hear what I have to say. I am going to tell you the truth about some things that were hidden from you, as it would be much better getting it from me now instead of being tied up and forced to listen to Uchiha Madara's pity me, the poor misunderstood hero version of it, after Itachi dies. To start off with, I'm from about 5 years in the future. This is my second time going through this mission, though the last time around it went really, really differently. For one, Kakashi-sensei got a last-minute refill on my meds in Konoha and actually remembered to give them to me. He started. Sasuke sorta stared at him while he talked, looking as if he thought he was insane, but didn't move to leave. He took that as a sign to continue. Since Kakashi-sensei didn't give me the really neat clothes I've been wearing recently the last time around, I was stuck wearing that tracksuit with the Uzushio spiral on it rather than the Uzumaki clan marking. Because of this, the fights we had avoided because the Mist Ninja noticed what clan I was from actually took place. Since the fight with the Demon Brothers was my first battle, I kinda got scared and forgot to use clones on them. You and Kakashi ended up beating them up and tying them to a tree fully clothed. He continued. Sasuke made a HN noise as if he considered that scenario to be possible. We later met Momochi Zabuza after I nearly scared the poor rabbit to death much like the first time, except that I wasn't in super hyper mode. He did his whole grand entrance thing with the sword, which I kinda ruined. Instead of running off, he tried scaring the crap out of us with some sort of mist trick, then Kakashi-sensei told us how he got his nickname. There was this huge fight between him and Kakashi that ended when Haku stuck a couple sunbon in Zabuza's neck and pretended he was dead. Kakashi-sensei passed out from overusing the Sharingan he keeps under his headband. By the way, how the hell did he get the Mangekyo Sharingan? I'm pretty sure I would have heard about it if he killed his best friend, and we carried him to Tazuna's house. He continued. Sasuke seemed to have found this scenario to be plausible as well, though he looked a bit shocked when he mentioned that Kakashi had a Sharingan eye and a Mangekyo Sharingan no less. Kakashi-sensei originally taught us the tree-walking exercise today, as he'd pretty much been slacking off instead of training us because he decided he didn't like us because of some stupid prank I pulled, and actually supervised us despite the fact he was hobbling around on crutches rather than wandering off and leaving us to fend for ourselves. A few days from now, while I was trying to master the tree-walking exercise, I met Haku, who was dressed like a girl at the time while he was wandering around looking for medicinal herbs, and we became friends. A week from now there was this battle on the bridge. Kakashi-sensei and Zabuza were fighting each other and I, and Haku were fighting each other while Sakura guarded Tazuna. Haku turned you into a pincushion when you jumped in front of an attack meant for me. I thought you died and sorta went nuts, and used some of the nine-tailed fox's energy to defeat Haku. Haku told me how his father killed his mother and tried to kill him because he had a Kekkei Genkai, and how he met Zabuza who gave him a purpose in life. Haku then jumped in front of an attack meant for Zabuza and died. That's about when Gato showed up with his thugs intending to take all of us out because he never intended to pay Zabuza and Haku in the first place, and had been hoping we'd kill them. Zabuza ended up killing Gato before he died. About 2 seconds before Zabuza died, he admitted he saw Haku as something more than a tool and asked to be buried next to him. Inari and the villagers he managed to rally defeated the rest of the thugs who had decided to pillage the village because Zabuza killed their meal ticket. We went home after the bridge that I later learned was named after me was built. he said, finishing his summary of the mission as it had been. What does that have to do with this truth you're going to tell me? Sasuke finally asked after staring at him as if he were nuts for a few minutes. Apparently, he hadn't found the scenario to be as reasonable as he thought he had, despite the fact that that was how it had actually happened the last time around. Well, I figured Haku would want to hear about it considering the fact he's hiding in one of the trees over there spying on us. I guess he has nothing better to do since Zabuza's not injured this time around, he said, ignoring the faint gasp that came from the bushes behind him. It seemed that Sakura had decided to join the eavesdropping party as well. As for the truth I'm going to tell you, the responsibility for the massacre of the Uchiha clan could be laid at the feet of Uchiha Madara, Shimura Danzo, Utatane Koharu, Mitokado Hamura, and a large percentage of the Uchiha clan itself, he said. Sasuke appeared to be considering his words, which seemed to be a good sign. It kinda all started when Madara had been forced to sign a peace treaty with the Senju by the rest of his clan. Despite the fact that he was pissed about the treaty that led to the founding of Konoha, he still expected to be named Hokage. This was not to be, however, and he ended up throwing a huge hissy fit when Senju Hashirama was named Hokage instead of him, and left to cause chaos and destruction. At one point, he tried to kill the first Hokage with a giant nine-tailed fox and failed miserably, nearly getting himself killed in the process. He continued. Sasuke Ned. Apparently, he'd heard a version of this story. Probably the one where Madara died at the end of that totally epic fight that had created the Valley of the End. Several decades later, Madara must have gotten bored or tired of controlling the Mizukage or something, because he decided to try and destroy Konoha with the nine-tailed fox. He failed at this as well because my father sacrificed himself to seal the fox inside of me, kind of forgetting that I'd be left an orphan and that Jiraiya was completely irresponsible and incapable of taking care of a small child. In the aftermath of the attack, the village came to the logical conclusion that it must have been a Uchiha that had turned the Kyuubi loose on them, as it had been an Uchiha who had been controlling the Kyuubi in the Valley of the End, and decided not to trust the Uchiha. Your father and a large percentage of the clan responded to this by proving themselves completely untrustworthy and planning a coup in which the Uchiha would take control of Konoha by force. The old man had learned of these plans and tried to come up with a peaceful solution because, if the Uchiha went ahead with their plans, they would spark a bloody civil war that would destroy the village, possibly the country, and maybe even start the Fourth Great Shinobi War. He continued. Sasuke seemed to be having serious doubts about the validity of this portion of the tale. Your father and his co-conspirators refused to come to a peaceful agreement with the Hokage. It was then that Danzo and the Hokage's two former teammates/advisors ordered your pacifist brother, whose loyalty was to the village as a whole rather than solely to the clan, to wipe out the entire clan, he said. This was probably the most important part of the story to Sasuke, since it revealed the real reason why his brother had killed the clan. After hearing it, Sasuke sat there for a moment, seemingly unable to process what he'd just said or how to respond, but finally, seemed to come to the decision that he should say nothing. He took that as a sign to continue. It had been while Itachi was wondering how he would be able to complete his mission by himself even if he had the Mangekyo Sharingan that he had run into Madara, who had shown up because he had yet again come up with another crazy scheme for destroying Konoha. Deciding to kill two birds with one stone, Itachi came to an agreement with Madara in which Madara would be allowed free range to get revenge on his clan for turning their backs on him as long as he left the rest of the village alone. When the time came, Itachi killed everyone who was involved in the planning of the coup while Madara just ran wild that night. Itachi couldn't kill you or allow you to be killed, however, as you were his innocent, beloved little brother. Instead, he put you under the Tsukuyomi so that you wouldn't see Madara making his escape and give the man reason to eliminate you as a witness, and so you would be motivated to kill him so you could become strong enough to take on Madara if the man ever tried to harm you. After the massacre, Itachi joined Madara's organization, which is called the Akatsuki, to keep an eye on Madara, who, incidentally, was the one who started the whole killing people with Kekkai Genkai thing in Kiri while he'd been controlling the Mizukage, and keep him as far away from Konoha as he could get him. He finished. Sasuke sat staring at him, seemingly unable to say anything after he had finished. Sakura was sitting in her bush crying, undoubtedly over the poor wounded soul of Itachi who had been forced to kill his family for the sake of the village. He hoped to God that the girl didn't try to stalk Itachi when he showed up to make his attempt at capturing him, as that would not end well. Haku was sitting quietly in his tree knitting what looked to be a scarf with a pair of sanbon, not bothering to hide anymore as he'd already been spotted and not been chased off or even told to leave. It looked rather relaxing. Maybe he should take up knitting as a hobby. Well, now that we've been pretty much brought to the present, I may as well give you some warnings based on mistakes you guys, or rather the yous from the future made. He said. Sasuke seemed to perk up or whatever at this. At least he wasn't looking as poleaxed as he had been moments earlier. You already know how this mission went since I already told you, and as it has been changed, I will just say to Haku that as long as you and Zabuza don't attack me, my team, or my mission objective and his family, I'll leave you alone. I actually like you, Haku, and would hate to have to kill you since you were rather nice to me the last time around, and used non-lethal force in your fight with me and Sasuke. As I have 5 years extra knowledge, including a jutsu I invented to take out an S-class missing nin about 4 years from now under my belt, it would be quite possible to kill the both of you this time around if I have to. He continued. Haku nodded to acknowledge that he had heard his warning as he counted his stitches at the end of the row to make sure he hadn't dropped any. As for you, Sasuke, I would advise you to not become a revenge-obsessed asshole. But, if you feel you absolutely must, don't turn traitor to Konoha and/or make destroying it your goal in life. The poor people who are just trying to get on with their lives don't deserve to have them ended because of something that asshat Danzo and his pet counselors did. Joining Orochimaru is a very bad idea, and is very, very wrong on so many levels. He said, turning to the boy who was still listening to him, or at least appearing to. If Orochimaru manages to bite you and give you a curse seal, whatever you do, don't use it. Also, have a qualified seal master such as Jiraiya or the old man contain it as soon as humanly possible. Kakashi's good, but he isn't a master. If Orochimaru somehow gets a toehold and tries to take over your body, and you manage to absorb him rather than him taking control, run straight to Itachi as he has or would soon be able to get his hands on a solution to deal with the problem. The solution will involve severely stressing you out and exhausting you completely, but it would be worth it to be rid of Orochimaru. It will also quite likely kill Itachi in the process, but, as he is already dying from some sort of disease and actually wants to commit suicide by younger brother, you shouldn't feel as guilty about it this time around. Whatever you do, don't join Madara. That guy's a fucking lunatic and will quite likely turn on you if and when it suits his purposes, despite the fact that you're related and you'll bear a disturbingly striking resemblance to his brother in a few years. Seeing as that guy didn't have any problems killing your favorite baby cousin in his crib, you should be understandably wary of him. He said, hoping that Sasuke wasn't still sitting there just to humor him, and only pretending to listen as he appeared to have gone into his arrogant bastard default mode. If you ignore my advice and do end up joining Orochimaru for some insane reason, such as seeking revenge on Madara and the council or something, don't sign the apprenticeship contract. After the other you breached the contract by consuming Orochimaru, no person in their right mind would train him even if he crawled to them on his hands and knees and promised daily blowjobs. Oddly enough, if Orochimaru had experimented on him, taken control of his body, consumed him via osmosis or some other means, or simply killed him in a fit of pique, it wouldn't have been a breach of contract unless stated otherwise, which it hadn't been. He concluded. How would eating Orochimaru after he died be a breach of contract? Sasuke asked, looking puzzled. He was alive when you, absorbed him. He replied. He was alive when I ate him? Sasuke said, looking shocked, horrified, and disgusted. He blinked, briefly taken aback by the fact that Sasuke was more concerned over the fact that Orochimaru had been alive at time of consumption rather than the fact that future Sasuke had eaten him. Right. I forgot about the Uchiha funerary rites, and why you should stay the hell away from any of the dishes that contain meat if you're ever invited to a funeral. He muttered to himself. He'd learned about the funerary traditions firsthand when some old guy had insisted that he be allowed to attend his entire funeral and not just the public part that was for the benefit of any friends the deceased might have in the village when he was 3. As only a Uchiha could consume an Uchiha, since the tradition of eating the dead had something to do with nourishing the clan and ensuring that the deceased would be with them forever or something like that, there had been an adoption of some sort. While he was listed as Uchiha Uzumaki Naruto on some form somewhere, that didn't stop the bastards from putting him back in the orphanage the instant the funeral was over. While disturbing and rather disgusting from his point of view, it was just one of those clan quirks. Each clan had their own quirks, which included their own seemingly bizarre funerary traditions which had surprisingly practical origins. The Uchiha tradition had come about over several long, hard winters, one of which had been harder than the rest, and started off the beginnings of the tradition. The Inuzuka tradition of burying the deceased's dogs with the deceased even if they had to kill them first had its roots in the fact that while friendly to others, the dogs will bond with only one person and wouldn't fight alongside anyone else inside or outside of the clan without their partner present. In the past, it had been pretty common for a dog to stay at the graveside of its deceased companion, refusing to eat until it starved to death. To spare the dog a slow death of starvation, it was decided that if the dog survived its companion's demise, it would not be by long. He'd learned this after Inuzuka Hana's funeral. From the barfing sound in the bush, it was a sure bet that Sakura was starting to reconsider becoming Mrs. Uchiha. Why the civilian-born ninja never seemed to consider these things when they tried to marry into a clan, he didn't know. Tenzo wondered how he would breach a certain topic of discussion with Jiraiya. He and Kakashi had forgotten to ask what kind of future Jiraiya had come from last night. Pakin's lecture on the multiverse had been informative and rather interesting, though extremely difficult to wrap his head around. Apparently, if a situation could go one way or another, it would go both ways. Each way would split off into a different universe. As situations could go many different ways, there were hundreds and thousands, possibly even millions of different universes breaking off every second, adding to the already infinite multiverse. Kakashi-senpai had come from a world where Sasuke had not stayed his hand at the Valley of the End, leaving Naruto dead rather than wounded. While Kakashi-senpai had ostensibly gotten his Mangekyo Sharingan from the same event as the Kakashi he knew and worked with on Team Kakashi 3 years later, it was under very different circumstances. This Kakashi-senpai hadn't come across a completely still and unbreathing Naruto who miraculously started breathing again when he picked him up to carry him home after standing there a couple of minutes blaming himself for the boy's death. This Kakashi-senpai had come across a dead Naruto who'd had his throat cut by a boy who months earlier had taken what he had thought to be a fatal attack for the boy. What had it been like for Jiraiya? Had he lost his student before he had really gotten to know him, or had he lost his student after spending years on the road with him? Had Naruto released the Kyuubi much earlier, or had some other event entirely precipitated his journey through time? What horrors had Jiraiya seen that would make him desperate enough to try something that could just as easily be suicide as it could be time travel? Chapter 16, Haku, Zabuza, and Uchiha Funerary Tradit. Haku smiled as he stowed his knitting in his bag and jumped out of the tree he'd been perched in. Today had been quite interesting. He for one didn't doubt the Uzumaki's time travel story, as the boy knew things that were either top secret or secrets that only he or Zabuza knew. Quite a bit of it made sense. There had been legends of seal masters bending time to their will and cautionary tales of seal masters who tried and failed spectacularly. If the man who had used seals to travel long distances instantaneously and managed to seal that which had been considered unsealable had left his writings behind for his son, who knew what could have been amongst them? If he himself had been given the power to change things, he would have done so in an instant. The story about Madara controlling the Mizukage fit, as when Zabuza-sama had tried to assassinate Yagura, he'd been forced to flee from someone who'd stepped out of the shadows, someone who had been controlling Yagura's actions somehow. The explanation for the Uchiha massacre fit as well, considering the things he'd heard from Zabuza. In the last years before the massacre, the Uchiha had become increasingly scarce on missions of a more critical nature and, their presence on missions above a low A had practically vanished altogether in the final year. If they had been planning a coup, it would make sense to remove them from missions on which they could conceivably cause harm to Konoha's future, or for them to remove themselves from missions which were likely to kill them and reduce their clan's number of able fighters for when the time came. The Uzumaki could only have known how he viewed himself as Zabuza's tool if he heard it from him himself, however. Hearing that despite how he acted towards him, Zabuza viewed him as something more than a tool had warmed his heart. Zabuza was more than a mere master to him, and he wasn't willing to give his life to just anybody. To learn that his admiration for Zabuza-sama was at least partially returned increased his determination to remain at his side and in his service until his dreams were fulfilled. From what he overheard, it would seem that the Uzumaki's dark-haired teammate was willing to turn traitor to his village and aid those who would destroy it and therefore was a dangerous person to keep around. Why did the Uzumaki spare his teammate when he knew the boy would become a traitor though? Did he see something salvageable in him? Or was it for the Uchiha who had been loyal to Konoha and sacrificed everything to keep it safe, the Uchiha who had done all he could to keep his younger brother alive despite the fact that said brother was completely unworthy that the Uzumaki had stayed his hand? He could hear the Uzumaki's respect for Uchiha Itachi despite his words and his almost mocking mention of the Uchiha's desire for suicide by younger brother. Deciding to muse on this and other things such as Gado's planned betrayal later, he made his way back to where he and his master were staying. Momochi Zabuza sat polishing his sword as he prepared for a battle he would much rather avoid but couldn't afford to. That's what he got for being stupid enough to actually sign a contract, however. Master Zabuza, Haku said, getting the swordsman's attention. What? He asked. Uzumaki Naruto once again thanks you for his new pet, and says that he will not harm us if we do not go after his team, his friends, or interfere with his current mission. Haku replied, apparently very carefully choosing his words and quite possibly trying to feed him a half-truth based on his expression. He also gave us some useful information in good faith. It seems that Gado has hired a large number of thugs that will arrive at Tazuna's bridge roughly a week from now, and their orders are to kill us as well as the Konoha shinobi as Gado does not plan on paying us. The Uzumaki will allow us to deal with these thugs if we so choose. The Uzumaki also gave us the names of several people we should avoid dealing with in the future if it is at all possible. At the top of the list is the Akatsuki, which is led by the madman Uchiha Madara, who had been controlling Yagura, has twice tried to destroy the village he helped found, and has on multiple occasions killed infants and small children for reasons other than the fact that it was part of a mission. Another name is that of Shimura Danzo, who is willing to manipulate anyone if it benefits him or supposedly benefits Konoha. A third is that of Orochimaru, whose perverse fascination with Kekkai Genkai has led him to kidnap children and adolescents with such abilities and experiment on them. He experiments on ordinary ninja as well, trying to turn them into monstrosities. Haku continued. How did the Uzumaki come by this information? He asked, genuinely surprised that the Uzumaki child would give him something as valuable as what he appeared to have in payment for a small rabbit. He earned it through experience. Uzumaki Naruto's father, the fourth Hokage, was a seal master of unparalleled skill, reputed to have been able to bend space and time to his will. Things in the future got to the point that the Uzumaki became desperate enough to use his legacy, which would have more than likely killed him rather than sent him back if the story I heard from one of my teachers about a lesser seal master who had tried was true. Haku replied. What? He yelled as he shot to his feet, dropping his sword in the process. This was absolutely unbelievable. Not only was the Uzumaki an Uzumaki, but he was the bastard offspring of the only man who had had a flee-on-sight order issued only for him and him alone, and not the rest of his family as well. The people in IWA were going to shit themselves when they found out that Namake's Minato had reproduced. As it was, he was barely keeping himself from doing so. From what I could interpret of what he had allowed me to overhear, the Uzumaki traveled back in time to save Konoha from one of his teammates who turned traitor to the village in the near future and joined Orochimaru, who he then betrayed before joining Uchiha Madara, who tried to destroy the village with the Kyuubi which the fourth Hokage ended up sealing inside him. Haku said. His teammate is a Jinchuriki? He screamed. If things were bad before, this just made them worse. No, the Uzumaki is. Haku replied. He sat back down before he fainted. He was contractually obligated to go up against a time-traveling Uzumaki who was also a Jinchuriki. If there weren't severe penalties for breaking the contract he had signed with Gado, penalties that would have bounty hunters and hunter-nin from every country on the continent on his tail, he would have run for the hills and beyond. Because he'd been less than careful about who he took a job from, he'd had the misfortune of being pitted against the one Uzumaki who'd been given a double dose of crazy, Namake's Minato for a father, and the freaking king of demons to boot. Please tell me you were lying. Sakura said. About what? Naruto asked. About Sasuke eating people. She replied. I wish I could, but, you know how it is, ancient custom, the origins of which are lost to the mists of time, but continue to be practiced because that's how it's always been. The Uchiha have eaten their dead for centuries, something about those who passed nourishing the clan and living on in future generations. Eating someone from outside of the clan was seen as a sign of extreme respect. Most people never said anything about it because it was just another one of those clan quirks, like with the Inuzuka and how when a member of the family dies, all of that person's dogs are buried with them, even the ones that were alive at the time of the person's passing. I think some scholar traced the source of the Uchiha tradition back to the early days of the clan when they got stranded somewhere inhospitable during a particularly hard winter, but I'm not 100% certain. Part of Sasuke's problem with Itachi was that he didn't come back to help properly tend to the clan dead, and the village didn't seem to understand Sasuke's duty because the lot of them were cremated for health reasons while he was in the hospital, which is seen as a bad thing for Uchiha as it is a sign of being considered an outcast, not worthy of nourishing the clan and so forth. Naruto said. She turned green. When she had decided that she wanted to be Mrs. Uchiha, she had never considered the traditions she would be bound to follow after she married Sasuke. She had just seen herself in a romantic future with her incredibly handsome Sasuke, and with a family name that had been known amongst the shinobi for centuries and was practically considered royalty. What other secrets did the Uchiha hide? What about the other clans? Now that she was hearing the things that nobody really bothered to comment on for the sake of village unity, she started to understand why her parents had attempted to dissuade her from pursuing Sasuke and tried to get her to find a nice boy from one of the civilian families instead. Kakashi wondered what crawled up the traitor's ass to make him storm into Tezuna's house the way he did when he returned from training, and was still wondering when he watched Naruto lead a rather ill-looking Sakura up the path and into the house. Naruto, did you offer her any strange mushrooms? He asked. He really needed to have a serious discussion with the boy about the consequences of offering potentially poisonous food to his friends. He'd caught Naruto eating death caps twice during training, but had left him to it since it apparently hadn't been hurting him. The same could not be said for Sakura if she were stupid enough to eat the same. No, I think she's sick because I told her about Uchiha funerals and stuff. Naruto replied. I'm surprised that you remembered, considering the only one you attended was the one for your mother's friend Haku when you were 3. The only reason they let you in was because it was specified in his will. Considering the fact that only a Uchiha can eat a Uchiha, there was some controversy until Fugaku named you as one of the few adopted outsiders. You're listed on a couple of documents as Uzumaki Uchiha Naruto. That didn't stop them from sticking you back in the orphanage after the funeral when nobody wanted to take you in though. He said. He remembered his own experiences with the Uchiha funerary traditions and the sad facsimile of a Uchiha funeral that what was left of his team and Obito's father had given Obito after he had been posthumously cast out of the clan for giving him his eye. It had been difficult, and he, Rin and Minato-sensei, had to keep telling themselves that this was what Obito would have wanted to keep from puking.